Friends and colleagues, could I get you to come to order, please? I feel like this should be louder, right? Hello? Really, really close. Oh, that's intimidating. I need someone to can you tap on a glass? The universal sign of order. No, with the pen. There we go. It's like a wedding. It works everywhere. You tap a pencil on glass and people just quiet down. Look, I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone here and thank you for joining us at this panel today on Gender Lens Investing. I probably got the title wrong, but you have the programs in front of you. We're already 3 minutes behind, so we're going to try and catch us up. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend those respects to any Indigenous people who are joining us here today. My name is Amy Haddad. I'm the Principal Sector Specialist for DFAT and the Head of DFAT's Gender Equality Branch. And it is my deep pleasure to be hosting and facilitating this panel today of these amazing humans that we have here to talk to us about gender lens investing and how we can move capital to support gender equality outcomes. I will just very quickly introduce the panel to start with. It'd be good if I was on the right page of my notes. I'm going to be really innovative today. So we have, I'm going to start with Joy. So down the end we have Dr. Joy Anderson. Joy is a prominent national leader in the intersection of business and social change, whose insights and experience have helped shape hundreds of ventures, as well as the movements of impact investing and gender lens investing. Next we have James, who currently serves as the Impact Investing Director of Investing in Women, which is a DFAT sponsored program, working in Southeast Asia. James is working with impact investors and developing blended finance instruments to move capital with a gender lens to the region in support of women-owned and women-led small and medium enterprises. Next we have Sally Moyle, who I like to call the mother of gender lens investing in DFAT because she was instrumental in getting this program set up in the first place, and so I honour you, thank you. Sally was formerly the Principal Gender Specialist for DFAT and is now the Chief Executive of CARE Australia. Next we have Amanda Japp. Amanda is the Facility Manager for Pacific Rise, which is another Australian government funded initiative. Pacific Rise works with investors and financial intermediaries to partner with businesses in the Pacific to secure impact investment funding. And finally, but not least, we have Will. Will is the design lead for Frontier Innovators and Incubators, an Australian government-funded initiative to develop infrastructure. I've got inverted commas in my notes, so I'm just going to give you them here. For social entrepreneurs in the Asia-Pacific by directly training program managers, connecting intermediaries across the region to support each other and sharing global best practices. So everyone's going to get a chance to talk today, so you can ask them questions about, why they volunteered to do this in the first place. I'm going to give you a really quick overview of how DFAT came to this. My notes say, Australia is a world leader in gender lens investing in our region and globally, and you won't often hear Australian bureaucrats say that they're the leader at something. But Joy in particular has really encouraged us to say, actually, DFAT did this sneaky little thing and suddenly here we are kind of at the front of the field, particularly in our region. And this came about, and again, we need to acknowledge Sally's contribution here through the work we did through gender lens investing, through investing in women, but we've also now managed to roll out the concept of gender lens investing across all of DFAT's impact investment programs within the department, and that means 100% of what we do on impact investing has a gender lens, which is pretty exciting. I'm not going to answer the question, what the hell is gender lens investing, because I'm going to actually get Joy to do that. But what we're going to be a little bit different here today. I'm going to do two things that might not ordinarily happen on a panel session. Firstly, I'd like to know who we have in the audience, because it's been my experience that when we have these conversations about gender lens investing, there's generally a pretty mixed group of people, and so everyone's coming from a different point of understanding. So we're going to do a little bit of group participation. You won't have to talk to anyone. Don't be shy. So, are there any investors in the room? Oh, excellent. Who's from the finance sector? It's okay. Anyone managing super funds here? Or fundraisers? No? Okay. Academics. Who are the academics? Come on, don't be shy. There we go. Who's engaged in private sector engagement? All right, it's a pretty good mix. Who do we have from the community sector and from NGOs? Yeah, that's what I thought would happen. Who's going to identify themselves as a gender specialist? Excellent. And development practitioners, hands up. Great. Okay, so this is the inverse of what I usually see when we have this conversation. I'm usually talking to financiers who are going, so gender's good. So this is good to know who's in the room. Now, the other thing we're going to do that's different from ordinary panels is I'm going to get you guys to ask some questions now, and then we're going to use those to try and shape what the panel talks to later. And my esteemed colleague, Trisha, down the front here is going to be writing those down and passing them to me. And a shout out to Trisha, who is actually the manager in DFAT of Investing in Women and is actually the powerhouse behind the operation. So, so many people volunteering to write. Okay, excellent. Sally Moyle, ladies and gentlemen. Who's got some just grounding questions they want to put up front in lights before we start the conversation to help shape it? Okay, there's a question. Well done. If I had chocolate frogs, I would hand them out.
Go to the person closest to me.
Oh, okay, we're going to go over here first.
Yeah, thank you so much for this session. All my favorite people are there on the stage today. My question to the panel is that we have been having these conversations around gender lens for almost a decade now. And we have made some progress, and we are now focusing on how do we have more gender lens focused funds across the globe. But what would it take to shift the conversations from creating these new structures to mainstreaming gender across everything we do, across every program, every intervention, every investments which happen across the world, because we are talking about 50% of the population across the world. Thank you.
Excellent question. And there was the lady in the white jacket up here.
Everyone says that. Okay. Thanks, Amy. Mine is a very basic question. Will you define right at the beginning as to what you mean by impact investment as well? Because otherwise this becomes a really big conversation, and I think the previous speaker sort of alluded to that. So if you could define that before we go on. Thank you.
And then there's two questions to your left there, Trisha.
Thank you. I'm Veronique Salzerozak from ADB, the Asian Development Bank. My question is in a way related to Joe's question about definition. Are you also going to be talking about shared value? And if yes, how do you dissociate the two? Or do we talk about shared value in a different way as impact investment? What is the additionality?
Hi, my name's Karen Docking from Cardno. I'm interested in all of the discussion, which is why I'm here, but I'd like to just know something about how you, what your lessons learned in relation to monitoring and evaluating both the short-term and the longer-term changes you want to see.
And Trisha, down the front for gender balance, I have a gentleman wanting to ask a question. Right down the front.
Over there, I think, as well.
Just over here, and then I think we need to go to the other side of the room for like left-right balance as well. Oh.
My question is also a definitional one about investment. I noticed the language of investment is used for almost all foreign aid these days. And so my question is, how do the two stories relate? And the second one is, in my particular interest, is marginal communities and marginalised women and what they do at the very basic community level with their little market and market stall and the like.
And then over on this side.
If everyone can hear me, I can.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
Actually, like this.
Yes. Oh, sorry, I should have said that. We're streaming this on the YouTubes, so if you have an objection to that, you should leave now.
My question, and I'm trying to relate gender to climate change in this issue. Within finance and investment, climate change has a number of innovative new instruments emerging, green bonds, blue bonds, etc. Do you see space in the gender field for similar or different innovative financial instruments emerging in the same way it did for the climate change field?
Okay, I'm going to take one more question, and then I'm going to put pressure on the panel to answer those questions. So just here.
So a little bit different take on innovation. So I wondered to hear what the panel thought about direct links between the innovation economy and investing with a gender lens.
So can you just say that again? I didn't quite catch it.
Links between the innovation economy, So not innovative instruments, but like, not scaling, because we all know that's loaded, but this question of how does gender lens investing link to help pushing the communities or states or countries towards more innovative economies?
Okay, what time do we have? Excellent. Okay, I'm going to start with, now there will be more time for questions at the end. This is not your only chance. So no pressure, Joy, but you're going to set us up for the conversation with a 10 to 15 minute world tour of gender lens investing. If you can respond to some of those questions, great. Otherwise, we'll leave it to the panel. And I'm getting a secret note here. Excellent. Oh, great. Thank you. Joy, did you? Okay.
Oh, brilliant. Well, it's great to be here. I'm going to move this away for just a second. So my name is Joy Anderson. I lead a think tank out of the U.S. Called Criterion Institute, but I spend an enormous amount of time in Australia because I believe that Australian government, particularly DFAT, is the global leader in sort of setting the standards for what governments are doing in gender lens investing. And I give speeches that say that all over the world, hence I just want the Australians to back me up from time to time on that point. And so part of the reason, part of my journey into this is, while I was a high school teacher for my 20s, I never really thought I was going to do anything except social change. I landed in finance, happenstance, and turns out there's just a bunch of power that sits in these systems of finance where all the capital sits and they make decisions in all kinds of intriguing ways. So I had landed in a pension fund and was working on pension funds or superannuation funds. And then I decided to launch a venture fund. Because why not? It's a Tuesday. I've never had any actual, significant amounts of money, but thought this was it was the beginning of impact investing. It was before impact investing was impact investing. And again, there was this sort of gap of people having conversations, so I thought, why not? I know something about social change. Impact investing, which is defined in many different ways, but I'll try to give a quick definition, was just starting, and I thought, cool, people trying to use finance to create social change, maybe I should show up for that. And so myself and a couple friends created a company called Good Capital. Good Capital was one of the first impact investing venture funds in the world. And so this would have been 10, 11 years ago. So I went on from that to be the woman who's the head of a venture fund. If you know anything about finance, that's a very rare commodity, so I found myself on all kinds of panels because they needed to find a woman. So a couple years after that, I was walking through the halls of SOCAP, the Social Capital Markets Conference, which my partners had founded, so I should know the name of it. And I was walking with a very dear friend, Shari Barenbach, who ran the Calvert Investment Fund for a long time. And we noticed that one more time, there was innovation happening, but nobody was talking about gender. And probably even more importantly, nobody was talking about power. There was sort of a general sense that we were going to innovate our way to a new future, and structural inequities would just fall away and just disappear because we had the internet. And I found myself profoundly disturbed by this. And the who had capital wasn't changing, the who was answering the questions. It was essentially the people who had discovered that the old math wasn't working had new math, but they were the same people as had done the last math. And so I remember being on a keynote at SOCAP at some point saying to the former managing director of JP Morgan, just because you found new math, you don't get to run it all again. And so out of those kinds of instincts, Criterion and about eventually 20, 30, now thousands of other organizations really started the field of gender lens investing. And to be clear, the gender lens investing it is today, as a field, just a reframe of efforts that come for hundreds of years before, right? It is not a new thing. It is not new activity. People were looking at women-led businesses. People were paying attention to diversity in corporations. People were looking at the impact of products and services on women and girls. This was not a brand new idea, but true to often in the women's movement and other movements, I don't think the women's movement has a claim to this only, we are dividing up into little silos and saying, no clean cook stoves, no women on boards, as if we should choose between those. So all we did in building this field was to create an umbrella so that in the context of finance, we could be having a conversation about gender and naming who is having a conversation about gender, which is, by the way, a conversation about all the sexes, all genders, right? It is not just about women. It is about all of the ways in which there are gendered power dynamics within the world. And so working to name that as a broader field so that we could have a real conversation about gender. So that's what I've spent the last 10 years of my life doing. So gender lens investing, as a definition, you could name it, you have two choices. You guys asked me to name impact investing. I believe that was a little bit of a political question. I'll maybe not fall deeply into that trap. I think impact investing has very different definitions depending on where you are geographically within the world. So in the US, it largely means private equity going to companies that are trying to create a social good. But globally, and particularly in Asia, it means kind of all kinds of financing that are moving towards impact. I want to table the question of how broad the definition is and whether that's a problem, which seem to be a couple themes. Maybe we can come back to that afterwards. Because I do think the question of should we narrow it or should we keep it broad is a worthwhile debate. My core thing is I do not want gender lens investing to be an issue area subset of impact investing. I don't want to be a niche of a fringe. Right? At some level, gender affects, in my opinion, every investment on the planet. There is an analysis that is baked in assumptions about the current and the future patterns of gender. There is no investment made, including all of the climate investments, that don't have gender implications. They also have implications in terms of many other kinds of identities because we're human beings. So they also affect religion, they also affect questions of race and ethnicity, all kinds of things come up, and ignoring that is what finance is really, really good at, because they're like, no, we're not biased. This is just the facts. So our definition of gender lens investing is a process definition as opposed to an outcome definition. And we made a really important choice here. You could make a different choice. There are many definitions of gender lens investing that say that the gender lens investment is defined by its intent to create outcomes. So the gender lens investing is about intentionally seeking to create gender equality outcomes. I'm good with that. Here's the challenge. To be able to pay attention to questions of gender and power, you need to change how you do analysis. You need to change the lens that you use to see the world. And so I fear efforts to point capital at women versus to change how we see power in the world. Hence, a process definition to say incorporating a gender analysis into financial decision making to get to better outcomes. So that's our operating definition. So it's a process definition, not the outcomes. You could then name what outcomes you wanted out of that process, but it forces you to pay attention to what are we actually changing about what we're doing, so that you don't end up with some of my favorite comments of, well, I would invest in a woman, but I can't find any. Or a report that's about to come out that y'all can see when it comes out that ends with a conclusion that says any investments with a gender lens are going to have lower returns and be smaller deals. Because, you know, we're not 85% of the purchasing power women. No, we're like some niche market off to the side, right? So part of the question, so first question is, that gives you a little bit of a scope of what gender lens investing is. 3 other quick things that I want to point to. One is there is huge momentum behind this. So that comes from a couple different places. One is you all hear the language of investment, the power of the private sector, people saying actually it's private capital that are going to accomplish the SDGs, right? Because we can't get enough money from philanthropy and donors, so we're going to need all this private capital. And anybody who wants to do that, who has then a gender policy behind it, is pushing to say, we're going to do gender lens investing. So most governments out there right now have some kind of gender lens investing strategy. More importantly, though, or differently importantly, the private sector. So the wealth transfer, the transfer of assets, you know, so that women are going to be the largest asset holders on the planet soon, is driving wealth management firms to say, how do we say to our female clients that we're addressing gender? So to your question about climate and gender, I hear really often from wealth managers and asset managers that they're getting asked for 2 things. Tell me how I'm addressing climate, tell me how I'm addressing gender. And increasingly, it's those 2 together. It would be really great if somebody could come up with a climate fund that actually also addressed gender. Then they would like have all the money. So there is a significant momentum behind this, which gets to my next point, which is why you in this room are so desperately needed. There is a significant possibility that all this money could move and not create gender equality outcomes. It could be a whole bunch of tick-a-box for women on boards. It could be, look, I found a woman entrepreneur. It could be the entire menstrual, the entire sanitary pad industry affects women, so I count, right? Or I work on reproductive health, and all reproductive health products have a gender lens to them. No, these are not true, right? So the question of making sure that the genius of the people who have spent decades working on paying attention to getting to gender equality outcomes in the context of development, I truly understand the suspicions that this is all fluff and buster. But it's a lot of money moving. And the question is, how do we make sure that it can get to the best possible outcomes? So the final point is, to be able to get to the best possible outcomes, we focus on 3 things. One is paying attention to the underlying analytics. We could point money at women, but have we actually changed how we value women's role and therefore the entire informal economy? Do we change our underlying calculations about whether or not we see informal economies as valuable? So changing the underlying analytics of what people think in finance is valuable. Second, paying attention to power in structures. And this is where donor agencies have just an incredible role, where they can step in and change the structure to ensure that For example, if somebody is working on a new impact investment and they are trying to have gender equality outcomes from that, don't you think they should have some level of a partnership with some organization that actually knows something about gender in the region? Right? So the question is, how do civil society organizations become part of this? And how do we structure that as a requirement for making investments so that the knowledge and the power is actually changing? We're not just pointing money in a different direction, but changing the underlying power dynamics. The third thing is actually paying attention to the how. Right? So Will and I have had lots of conversations about this, but there's this thing about accelerators and pitch festivals, right? Pitch festivals don't work for lots of people. They don't move capital particularly well, but they're a wonderful performance of finance. So everywhere we go, we put investors in the audience and entrepreneurs on the stage and say, look, we're performing finance, even if it doesn't work, even on its own terms. So the question of how do we actually introduce questions of transformation, not just accommodation. I don't want to be taught how to pitch. Apparently, I'd probably be pretty good at it. But I don't want to be taught how to pitch. I want collaboration to be introduced as the value, perhaps more important, and that gets better financial and development outcomes than competition. So thinking about process, thinking about structure, and thinking about the underlying analytics, where you sit, lean into those questions, not in kind of like a lean, it's just a phrase, she took a book, made it more, but think about how do you lean into that, join those conversations, and make sure they're done right.
I feel like you could have like dropped that mic, right? Yeah, and you would definitely do well in a pitch festival. Where to start with that? Excellent questions from the audience, and then this, I think, extremely useful and grounding reflections from you, Joy. What I actually want to do, this is not prescripted, so this is actually gender lens improv, I think we decided we would call it. And what I actually want to do, I actually want to start with Sally because she's in the middle, so that feels right. But also, Sally, I feel like you occupy this really interesting position in that you came from having pitched this to DFAT and getting, DFAT on board. Now you're in care. You're not in the private sector though, and you're clearly a supporter. And so you kind of exist in this potentially awkward but also very influential space. And how are you experiencing this, and how are you reconciling some of those challenges that we're seeing? And I really liked, Joy, your transformation, not accommodation. I think that's a really important sort of takeaway for us, particularly given the number of gender experts we have in the room. Sally, you're a gender expert. What's triggering for you in this discussion?
Well, I mean, for me, I always used to say as a gender specialist that everything's about gender, and gender is about everything. And so it's incumbent on us to infiltrate, to colonise every aspect of life. And as you say, Joy, it's about power, and power resides in the private sector, in private finance, right, in our world. And if we leave that gender blind, we will be never succeeding in our aims to achieve gender equality. We just won't. It's up to us to colonise everything. And capitalism should be transformed through a gender lens as well. The whole thing needs to be. So I came, and I have to say, I also want to give absolute credit in the design of investing in women to Shah Bowman, who's another DFATer, who's also a very really innovative thinker. So, it had many mothers, and so it came from the opportunity with a government that really cared about private sector development and investing the private sector to leverage funding for aid and development outcomes. And so we went, we can apply gender equality to anything, and so let's attach it to the minister's key priorities, which, we did. And I think it was the start of a movement across DFAT to do this stuff. And I was also able to influence, some of the other impact investing and investment programs in DFAT to make sure that they also had a gender lens. Because it really shocked me when we were doing the design with Jackie DeLacy for investing in women, talking to impact investors across Southeast Asia and seeing that already even at the very inception of this new industry in our region, gender gaps were opening up, and that women's owned businesses were just not being involved. And you know, as we know, that's the very first stage in introducing a gender lens. It's just the first, though. You know, you need to start by seeing women, and then you need to start by looking at gender equality. So that's where I've come from, and I'm now in care looking to really see if we can partner and bring our gender equality understanding to private sector partnerships. So I'm also on the board of the Global Compact Network in Australia, the business-led sustainability and SDG human rights movement. So using the experience I have from government and the civil society into moving towards as I say, colonising. We've got to colonise, and there is no space where gender equality thinking and development thinking shouldn't be infiltrating.
Right, okay, so we've reclaimed the word colonise. I want to take a pause before I ask my next question in case anyone thinks they're connected. Amanda, there was a question about, at the beginning, about, you know, how do we take this big kind of movement of capital and these big things around investment and actually connect those to the women who are most marginalised and who are most removed. And you work with Pacific Rise in the Pacific, and kind of one of the truisms we hear about this is impact investing works in Southeast Asia because, you know, the economy is bigger and there are more, you know, investors, but you know, no one's like, you hear skepticism about the Pacific, but that's where you're working. Sort of how are you translating this kind of this big concept into, you know, it's a challenging region, and you know, where women are challenged, and if you've got anything that connects that with climate change as well. I didn't prep you before that, so if you go, I don't know, climate change, that's fine, leave it behind. But you know, what does this feel like when we take these big concepts about moving, you know, potentially trillions of dollars, and we apply them to women in the Pacific?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I guess, as Amy mentioned before, I'm part of Pacific Rise, which is the Pacific Readiness for Impact Investment in social enterprises. So that's why we call it Pacific Rise. So we were established to, I guess, demonstrate how impact investment could look in the Pacific. And we partner with impact investment specialists from around the world. And I guess as part of our design, we came in very early thinking about, well, where does gender fit within this? And I guess in my experience, I've worked with a lot of private sector development programs, and gender's always been kind of the ticker box on the side. It's been the, well, as long as we do no harm, I think we're okay. So it was really cool to be part of a design where we said, well, let's figure out where gender can come in at the beginning and across the whole program. So we partnered with Pacific Trade Invest Australia, and also with the Criterion Institute to really set ourselves up for, you know, what does this mean in the Pacific, and how can we use that gender lens? And I guess there's a couple of ways, and going to Prachi's question around, you know, how do we mainstream this and not just make it about, you know, investing in women entrepreneurs or just you know, one little part. So we looked firstly about finding new partners. So as Joy mentioned, there's a huge amount of gender funds out there. There's a lot of you know, intermediaries who are actually focusing on gender lens investing, and they were a great network for us. So I think if we hadn't already kind of looked at gender as a way of expanding opportunities, we probably wouldn't have found all these new partners. And so we did actually take time to figure out who was moving money with a gender focus, who was interested in the Pacific, and how to get those two talking. And for example, we work with Impact Investment Exchange in Asia, and they've developed a women's livelihood bond, so a bond all around getting investment into women, into businesses, and to I guess enterprises that move money for women. And we've actually got them looking at Fiji, looking at the Pacific, and starting to think, well, hang on, where could the Pacific come into this model as well, into an investment bond? I guess in a couple other ways that we use gender lens, we also use it to find sectors that may be undervalued. So using that gender data to understand, I guess, where you know, sectors like creative arts within the Pacific, menstrual health, some of those sectors where a lot of women participate, and particularly in the informal sector, which is a big part, and I think every enterprise, every business that our intermediaries have found all have links to the informal economy, and that's a huge part, and many women are part of that informal economy. So it's really been important for us to, I guess, start looking at what are the types of finance, and maybe private equity coming from market rate returns aren't appropriate in those instances. What are the types of finance that can work for those businesses to actually reach those parts of the informal supply chain? And I guess an example of that is we worked with an organisation called Real Impact, and they have a very different way of looking at creative art. So where people look at handicrafts, this is more around creative arts. So how do we redesign the way we think about it? How do we put that onto a global platform? And how do we get entrepreneurs, creative arts industries from the Pacific finance in order to build up their businesses so they can then participate to these, think Alibaba type platforms. So they've been partnering with a group called Kiva, which crowdfunds a lot of money and puts money in. They've actually started to act as a Kiva intermediary, specifically to be able to get finance into that informal supply chain. And I guess just as a third point, we also work with gender organisations. So while we've been training finance intermediaries around gender lens investing, the important part on the other side was then to say, well, what about gender organisations and human rights organisations within the Pacific? To be able to get the seat at the table with everyone speaking the same language, how are we going, how do we do that? So the 3 countries where we had the most interest and the most visibility, we actually worked with a range of different gender human rights organisations, and in particular gender-based violence organisations, to train them, I guess, to better value the expertise that they have, to think about them as assets, and then to, I guess, link them with the organisations we work with. So I guess just as a sort of way of starting where we're coming from and how we've used that gender lens.
Terrific. Now, my next question is actually a joint question between Will and James, so I'm going to get you guys to psychically figure out who wants to talk first. But you both work, and I'll hand the mic over so you can dueling mics, but you both work in incubators with investors who are learning what this means, who've got, who've been convinced to think this is important but might not be amazingly skilled. And I think it would be useful to hear from you about sort of what do you see that, what does that trajectory look like? And I think it relates specifically to, again, Joy's point about transformation, not accommodation, but also to the earlier point about when do we move from creating new stuff to actually mainstreaming this? And I think you've got sort of different stories and insights on that, and I think it'd be useful to hear that.
Sure, maybe I can start. So just a little bit of background about investing in women. We started in 2016, and the goal overall is to promote women's economic empowerment. Our theme is that, investing in women is not only the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. So we lead by the economic rationale. Our I guess, manageable interest is working with the private sector, looking at what's their bottom line. There are a number of interventions. One, we work with large corporations, and what I lead is we work with commercial impact investors. And so far we have 4 impact investors that we work with, and some of the key learnings that we're getting about why are they interested in gender lens investing overall are 3 things that stand out. One is they see a market opportunity, at least in Southeast Asia. They're at the leading forefront. If you look at the impact investing community in any sector or even look at their website and you look at where they invest in, you hardly see gender at all as a drop-down issue or any kind of investments that are targeting any kind of gender outcomes. And so our partners see this as a huge opportunity in Southeast Asia, and in particular with the growing middle class and the female economy related to that, specifically in the Philippines where we're based, Indonesia, and also Vietnam. So that's the first area. Our partners see this huge untapped market opportunity that no other impact investor is really tackling strategically. The secondly is, by the nature of being impact investors, these investors care more about the profit maximization. They might care about the climate, they might care about education, healthcare, and as a consequence, it's not that far of a leap to say that they'll also care about gender. So there's an alignment of what they're trying to do to create the double, triple bottom line with gender lens investing. And our message to them and to the entire impact investing community has been, if you care about growing the impact investing community, if you care about impact overall in the kinds of investments you make, to ignore gender is a real big mistake overall. And then finally, another area of growing rationale and pain point for these impact investors is that, impact investors are fund managers and they respond to their client demands. So they're usually managing funds on high net worth individuals, family foundations, institutional investors, donors like DFAT as well. And so they respond to what their clients are telling them. And up to this point, frankly, we don't think enough of the clients are directing them to have an intentional gender lens with specific ways of actually how to do it. Okay? So those are the three ways in which we are at least coming up with areas where impact investors are becoming more and more commercially interested in gender lens investing and actually going above and beyond what we're doing together. Okay?
Thanks, James. So I'll try and take a couple of steps backwards and put our work in frontier incubators in context. But firstly, like most impact investment assets sit in funds, and funds that don't really distribute anything under $2 million investments. So we're working at the other end of that spectrum as part of the Scaling Frontier Innovation Program from the Innovation Exchange at DFAT. SFI for short. SFI is a 4-part program kind of working across the enterprise development pathway. For the most part, focused on building generative capacity in local entrepreneurial and investment ecosystems. So one of those 4 programs is Frontier Incubators, and this is working with business support services, so incubation acceleration programs. As part of that, we're focusing on building the, as you put it, infrastructure in brackets, available to local entrepreneurs to grow their businesses. This is financial and non-financial support, because incubators and accelerators often play a really critical role in catalyzing the financial support in their respective ecosystems, as well as directly providing non-financial assistance to entrepreneurs. Also, interestingly, based on the research or the data that we collected through our applications to the Frontier Incubators program, incubators and accelerators are largely staffed by women, interestingly. So as part of the Frontier Incubators program, and we've just received a small extension on the gender and power work within the Incubators program from Sasakawa Peace Foundation, but we're building out a set of offerings for incubators and accelerators. So the program itself is a capacity building program for incubators and accelerators, focused on building the quality of the services that they provide to enterprises, but also focused on building the sustainability and the stability of their operations as well, because those two things are inextricably linked. Relationships with mentors, relationships with investors, all of this stuff is held by people. And people don't stick around if they don't get paid. So hence the sustainability or the stability is linked to the quality of services. So as part of the incubators program, gender and power was really a consideration up front. How are these organisations marketing their services? How accessible are they to female entrepreneurs, but also to businesses seeking to impact women and children? How are they engaging local investors? Are they holding pitch days, to your point, Joy? And perpetuating really unhelpful power dynamics. And so through the program, I think we have this really interesting opportunity to interrogate the ways in which incubation and acceleration programs do not work for women. And the ways in which incubation and acceleration programs engage with early stage investor networks as well. Because like I was saying, they play a really critical role in developing their ecosystems, and a lot of that comes through their work with angel investment networks. So the folks that actually do provide investment at that sort of $20,000, $50,000, $100,000 mark, well under where most of the impact investment assets are sitting in funds. And so look, we're at the beginning of this journey, but we are building out, with the support from Sasakawa and from DFAT, a gender lens incubation acceleration toolkit, which will support incubation acceleration programs to interrogate these issues themselves, to engage civil service organisations in this practice as well, and to build into the way that they promote the actual services that they deliver to entrepreneurs and the way that they engage investors and for some of them also policymakers, a consideration of gender and power.
Fabulous. Now, I'm going to just put 2 more questions to the panel before I open it up for more questions from the floor. And I'm particularly interested to hear from anyone who wants to respond. And Joy, you might have a particular framing for this. There was a question at the beginning about the relationship between gender lens investing and shared value proposition. Do you see these things as related, as neighbourly prospects, as unrelated? How do you, as potentially able to positively influence each other? How's this sitting for you?
Yeah, it's actually, I've never gotten that question before, so it's fascinating. I do think, so in my experience, so shared value, to the best of my understanding, is looking to figure out how to partner, largely with corporates, to figure out how do we name the shared values to be able to collaborate more effectively. What happens in any form of corporate engagement, whether it's shared value or just CSR in general, corporate social responsibility, is you're looking to understand the logic of corporations to be able to change the policies and practices within a corporation. So where that links to systems of finance, but I just want to highlight that is the work of figuring out the logic in corporations, right? Who sits where? If you end up with the marketing people, have you really lost, right? How far are you from where the money sits? All those kinds of things that make sure that you're doing that practice well. So it is a logical extension to say, since many corporations are owned by investors, that finance can also be used to influence companies, right? So that where they're similar is they're saying that the unit of analysis, what you're trying to change, are the practices of businesses, right? And that you're just analyzing the power somewhat different. So if you want to understand what drives finance, you then understand what drives finance, and then here's the tricky bit. What power does finance have to influence the activities of corporations? So people pretty often, we have a large campaign right now around gender-based violence. So Criterion is seeking to prove globally that you can use finance to address gender-based violence. And the number one thing that everybody comes to me is, let's have one index that says who the good companies are gender-based violence and who the bad companies are, and we'll get out of the bad companies and put our money in the good companies. Okay, that's really not, that's hard, right? There isn't like 3 indicators that say what are the relationships. And so it's hard, and exiting investment money doesn't always change the behavior of companies. Many people would make the opposite argument, stay in a company and use your shareholder power to be able to influence it. So part of it is understanding an analysis of power, which, by the way, all of you who are gender experts in the room know how to do this because you know how to analyze power. It's just a different system. So the one other thing that finance can do, though, is, and I'll just end with this briefly, is finance not only influences companies, it influences whole markets, right? The internet, the development of the internet and the role that finance played within that it really wasn't just, a bunch of entrepreneurs sitting around. It was the people who gave them money and then the people who went and shaped policy to make sure that the entrepreneurs could build the internet, right? It wasn't just a couple companies going, I made this all happen. And so part of the question is thinking about how can finance influence markets, not just influence companies. So back to the gender-based violence example, if we eliminated all sexual harassment and sexual assault that happened inside of companies, we wouldn't have really made a dent on gender-based violence. In general, people tolerate sexual harassment at work less than they do at home. And so the question is, how do we get finance to say gender-based violence in the world is a problem, gender-based violence, increase of gender-based violence correlates with an increase in political risk, right? How do we get people in finance to say gender-based violence is a problem, full stop, and therefore can influence how governments act, create political will? So it's a complicated one, and you can debate me on it, Sally.
No, I wasn't. Can I just say something? Just to say, I think, you know, we in development know about thinking and working politically, and what we've got to seek to do is understand the landscape that we're trying to influence, understand what the barriers to change are, and understand what people's incentives to change are. And when we're looking at gender equality globally, we can look at it, we do have to look at it at a micro level, whichever forum we're working in, whichever domain we're working in, we need to engage on a gender analysis there with a politically informed power analysis as well. But the benefit of bringing in investment into the conversation and corporates is that you're increasing the size of the ecosystem, and you're looking at different levers and different incentives and different barriers, and you can look at them on a bigger and more macro level. So, and how can they influence each other? So, for example, CARE has done some research on the cost of sexual harassment in garment factories in the Cambodian garment sector, and we've used that to partner with corporates around shared value pieces, and you can start to build that kind, and then you use government, right, to drive incentives. So the modern slavery legislation that the Australian government passed just at the end of last year is going to be really powerful for driving those incentives. And so looking at all of the different levers in the world that we're living in order to remove the structural imbalances is really important, and I think it is important for us to use to understand the worlds of the people we're trying to influence. And so, as you said, Amanda, the piece about language, we development types and gender types don't often know finance. I mean, I always prided myself on understanding business a bit, right, and knowing their language. And then I remember going to the very first Gender Lens investment talk I heard from with you, Joy, back in, I think it was Bangkok in 2015, and just going, I don't understand any of this. You know, there's a whole new language I need to learn, and set about learning it, because you can't influence if you can't understand the incentives that drive other people.
Can I just build on that? I think what's so important about that point, Sally, is once you understand the incentives, you can do analysis to figure out whether using finance as a tool is useful. And I think part of the downside with all of the momentum is like, move private sector capital. Why? Right? To be able to answer the question of what actually is the literal strategy that you're using to move capital, and how that will ensure that you're reaching the development outcomes. I think if you know all the toys, you can then answer the question of which toy is actually useful, rather than being handed a toy and say, go do impact investing in the Pacific and make it beautiful. How?
So I think there's a point underneath both of those points, which is also, sitting underneath the analytics, a lot is data, right? And if you don't have the evidence, then it's very difficult to, when you're doing your bog standard, operating environment analysis for whether this is a good investment. I mean, we've just completely zeroed out any impact on women, right? We can't monetize it because we don't have the data. So my next question is going to be actually about monitoring and evaluation, which is like a super nerdy set of phrases. So maybe let's not talk about that. Maybe let's just talk about evidence and how do we know that this is working. But I do just want to do a little bit of a shout back to your point again about language. That was my exact experience as well. And Joy sat there with me. She just mentors principal sector specialists at DFAT, holds our hand while we go, holy shit, what was that? But I think, and given the preponderance of gender experts in the room, that cuts both ways. And it wasn't until I was sitting in a finance conference that I thought, this must be how people sitting in gender conferences feel who aren't gender experts and they don't understand what's happening. And so it's incumbent on both sides of this equation to develop a language that lets us talk to each other and to recognise we don't all have to have all the skills, we just need to join them up. So that's Amy's word for the day. But evidence, how do we know this is working? What can we say so far? And what does success look like, short, medium, long term? I'm going to actually throw to James on this first because I know he's thought about this a lot.
Oh, sure. Just to give you some background about how we work with these commercial impact investors, we provide them with what is called blended finance investment instruments. What that is we're underwriting the risk for them to enter a new market. In this case, the new market in Southeast Asia is women-owned, women-led businesses. If you look at the data, they are grossly underrepresented within the SME space, but and even more so within impact investing, surprisingly. So that's what we were set out to do, with the goal to mobilize more capital for women-owned, women-led businesses. Now, as a starting point, how we measure success, there are three areas. One is, are we de-risking investments, and are these, as a consequence, are these partners making deals? Secondly, are they crowding in private sector capital? So, I mean, it's great that you're underwriting an investor, but are other people doing the same thing, or are they crowding in over time? And then thirdly, you know, our pilot initiative with these partners are relatively small. I mean, in the millions of dollars, small compared to the global capital markets. But we're a success if after, you know, 5 years of working together, these partners are actually scaling our initiative across their entire organization, across their follow-on funds as well. So those are the three main areas that we try to judge ourselves with as a starting point. And of course, because we work with commercial investors who act as champions and who are going across the entire conference circuits, more or less, in impact investing, they are then championing for us why other investors need to be doing the same thing. Okay.
Can I just say one more thing about that? That's, it's really interesting as a gender person in development. I always used to say that that mainstream development practitioners had sort of developed a bit of scar tissue about gender, and they'd sort of just hunker down and let it wash over them and try and ignore it. But it's really with investors, it's not as if they're actually going, I don't agree with gender equality, I really don't want to do it. That when you raise these issues with them and explain it in a way that works for them, they're actually kind of quite keen, right? And often they will become champions for us. So, you know, they haven't built that scar tissue over decades of having, you know, trying to systemically avoid having to do anything about gender and development. So
that's right. I guess, I mean, from Pacific experience, and when we started out, we really wanted, and we're very early on, I must say that up front, so part of what we're trying to do is demonstrate what impact investment could look like in the Pacific, and I guess how we would do that with a gender lens, or how can a gender lens help to, I guess, make investments more better for women, more profitable. What are the tools that we can use in order to, I guess, get those finance intermediaries thinking more about gender, about a gender lens? So, so I think, you know, our kind of metrics around that are really about changing behaviour. So, you know, providing training, providing support, providing our expertise from the Criterion Institute. We call them the gift with purchase. So, you know, you buy us, you come in and work with us, and you also get our Criterion team. So we actually give all of that expertise to all of the partners that we work with, and you know, it sort of allows them to explore. And we don't go in there saying, you know, you must know about gender lens investing. We go in with an attitude of these are the things we can help you with. And I guess from experience, it's always been when we've talked to the private sector around why they partner with development organisations, and aside from the funding, it really is about expertise. I mean, development expertise, and in particular, gender expertise. So we never found this to be a very difficult conversation to have with intermediaries and with finance organisations. And the momentum of all the money that's available for gender finance, that was something that we were able to use. So by, I guess, bringing out intermediaries, training them, asking them to use these tools, so it's another set of analysis. Finance intermediaries get very excited about new data, new analysis that they can do over their investments to figure out if there's any risks or any opportunities that they can explore. So that really resonated with them, and I think that was quite interesting. Our first training, we had a lot of venture capitalists who came in thinking, okay, well, we'll tick this box and we'll get to work with DFAT. But they really came out of it saying, this is something we want to use. And there was a huge number of, well, small number of organisations that were in that training that have really changed the way they've worked. And I guess using an example from the Pacific, because one of those intermediaries worked with a fishing organisation in the Pacific, and that fishing company worked with youth, with fishermen, bought their entire catch. Part of that catch then was on-sold to hotels, so it was a high premium products. They only take 2 varieties of the fish. The rest of those products were then sold to women in the marketplace. So the way that they'd always seen that was that this part of it was very CSR, it was very much a social side of their business, and that the growth potential for their business always hinged around the profitability, the expansion of hotels and that side of it. But when these intermediaries came in and used the gender lens, they actually found the biggest growth potential was in the women in the marketplace who were buying up to 80% of the catch. And that was not just CSR. In fact, that's the reason why they actually went forward with an investment plan into that business, where they would have walked away ordinarily, is that they found this entire market that was completely undervalued and underserved. So I think for us, around that M&E question, it's about, I guess, getting examples of where this has worked, really using that evidence to, I guess, share amongst the community, which is one of the reasons why we kind of thought it was a good idea to actually start talking in these spaces, and yeah.
So I actually really love these examples because they look at the sort of process metrics of, if you give money to these intermediaries, are they investors? Are they changing their practices? And I think it's really powerful. I will add, though, Criterion just finished a partnership. We just finished the first phase of a partnership with the Global Impact Investing Network, which is the GIN for short, which is the largest network of impact investors. After, I think they've been in business for 10 years. I am somehow ashamed but happy at the same time to say that they finally have gendered metrics. So they just went live about a month ago, and so from the end outcome, right, because this is assuming that if they're doing these processes right, that the impact in the end will happen, and the debates about impact investing and what outcomes you can actually attribute to the investment are massive, but we sort of did our part to try to come up with a concrete set of metrics, both internally and then across 3 different sectors, that would at least get the conversation started. ICRW also has some pretty amazing tools that are coming out. So it's taken a long time. I would say for 10 years, people have been asking the question of how do we do metrics in gender lens investing. It's a massive question, though, right? Metrics in what sector? Like, well, just tell me the 3 things I should pay attention to. No. Not going to tell you 3 things to pay attention to. It's never going to be that simple. And so I think the GIN metrics are a good example of what's out there right now.
Just chiming in from the incubator accelerator side, I think there's 2 main metrics that we'll be looking at for the gender lens incubation acceleration work, and I mean these came up earlier in conversation with you, James. And I think one of them is cohort numbers, so the numbers of women-led, women-focused enterprises coming into the incubation acceleration program, and the other is investment numbers. And unfortunately, the painful story is at the latter end of that. So it doesn't really matter if you get to equity in cohort numbers. At the end of the day, the women enterprises graduating from these incubation acceleration programs will not get the same sort of investment. So those will be the 2 things that we're looking at. And we have to focus on the support for incubators and accelerators to engage early stage investors with the aim of trying to shift the outcomes at the end of these programs. And the other things we'll be looking at are the quality and fit of the services provided, and the gender analyses and gender strategies developed for cohort businesses as well. So.
Sorry. Thank you. Just, we talk about the missing middle where impact investing plays in a sense, because there's commercial lending, which is running by itself, and then there's microfinance and micro lending down the bottom. And, the kind of playing field for impact investing is largely in the middle between those things. And often investors, I think, tell me if you agree, but often the easiest thing for an investor to do is to just reach down into the top of that missing middle because, you know, you've got the same kind of governance arrangements. It's much easier for the organisation that's seeking finance from you to comply with the requirements that you've got. It's much harder to reach down to the top, to the very bottom of the missing middle, because people there are, you know, much more micro enterprises, haven't got the same kind of capacity for due diligence approaches, haven't, you know, got quite the same metrics maybe in terms of returns as well. And so sometimes that's part of the problem. And so the task for us is to find ways of providing incentives to investors to both recognise the value of reaching further down to the bottom of the missing middle, and that there's maybe different ways of approaching this whole business investment process by maybe congregating or aggregating businesses together, or seeing different ways of measuring value, for example, or providing incentives, as Investing in Women is doing, to kind of take off some of the risk from doing that. So I wonder if others who know more about this than I do have some thoughts on whether, you know, there's ways that we can both build incentives for that and measure it better.
I can't talk to the incentive space, and we're not investor facing, but the other way to address the missing middle is by addressing infrastructure, as we called it, so the support services that are available, and that's on the financial and the non-financial side. So building the quality of incubation acceleration services is one of those, right? At the end of the day, you're ideally lifting the missing middle. But on the incentive side, James?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. So if you speak with impact investors and you ask them, what's their sweet spot in terms of investments? You know, what's the size of their investment fund have to be for them to actually be profitable? And what's the ticket size? What's the investment size for their investees? They'll say that roughly they have to raise around $35 million. And that the investment size is roughly around $1 to $2 million that they have to deploy. Now, if you're making investments into small enterprises where small enterprises need around maybe $100,000 to $250,000, the transaction cost of getting that deal to close is the same as getting a $2 to $5 million close. And so that's the challenge, and that's where I think a lot of donors have to really chime in if we're going to really tackle the missing of the missing middle. Okay.
Yes, and that's one kind of money. I think part of the challenge is, you know, that's the traditional U.S. version of impact investors are largely, you know, venture debt and equity investors who are looking for a certain kind of high growth business. And I think part of the, you know, you and I have had lots of conversations about this, but part of the challenge is how do we look at all the toys and not just get stuck with the one that is shiny and sexy, which largely looks a lot like venture capital, right? There's a whole bunch of really boring kinds of factoring and trade finance that's like mind-numbingly boring and doesn't create poster childs of growth. Poster children, there's no children of big signs. It's much more granular, but it is most of finance. But it's not as sexy. So I think part of the challenge is how do we keep all the toys at play and not just say, well, here's an impact investor, they have this kind of money, so we have to find things that look like what they want. Let's go find other kinds of money, because there are other kinds of money that work in different markets. Okay, we can have this debate for a long time.
Okay. Now, Joy, I'm going to get you to hand that microphone across to Tricia. Oh, there we go. I'm going to open it out for questions again. I think we've got about 20 minutes for questions. We've just heard a lot, and I find that every time I spend time having this conversation, I go away saying, I want to work in a bank when I grow up. But you might not have reached that point yet. So if you've got questions, or you're going, I don't understand what you're talking about, or this just sounds like crap to me, you know, challenge the panel. They clearly like talking. And there's a lot of expertise here, so let's use that. Jackie DeLacy is going to go first.
This is a question for you, Amy. So it's Jackie DeLacy from Apt Associates. if Australia is at the forefront of this, how are you learning across all of those investments, and how do you share that learning more comprehensively? You have to be lucky to sit in a panel like this, so what can we do to help you document that learning and share it more systematically?
I feel like this is a Dorothy Dixer for me to say, check out the Investing in Women website. Is that the right answer?
No, it's not, because I think investing in women, we've got some learnings there, but you've got learnings. I mean, when Joy says Australia is a leader in this and DFAT is a leader in this, it's beyond investing in women. I think that's one of your leadership programs, but I think you've got to be investing in sort of comparative lessons, because there's so much rich information, and if Joy's right and you need to start thinking about other forms of capital, surely some of the ways in which you're trying to, have systematic change, you can take some of those lessons and apply it to the next generation of projects. So it's a little bit about how you learn across the different programs.
Yeah, look, in all seriousness, that is a very good question. And it does surface a conversation we're having internally, which is that we do actually have work to do on this in the department, in sort of pulling these pieces together. And it's challenging because some of it's been organic and has happened at different sort of levels across the system. And, I think I'm on YouTube, so I've got to be careful what I say here. But I think we're sometimes a little bit challenged in taking credit for where we're at. And so that means that sometimes we can be back-footed in putting that story out there. And we need to actually take the time to do that. I think internally, as bureaucrats, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm and in terms of actually what this is one of those gender conversations where we don't have to be defensive. That's actually what I like about it. So you can go into a conversation and say, hey, this is not just about risk management, this is about potential and innovation and actually being at the front. And isn't that great for, Brand Australia? So that conversation is definitely happening. I think we need to do more, though, to see what can we do to contribute to the to the knowledge that's out there. And I think one of the things I'm interested in doing is connecting more with the domestic conversation on gender lens investing, which I haven't been hugely connected with. So I think that's the next step for us as well. But that's a good reminder for me to do more work on this. Thank you. There's a question just here and then up the back as well.
The Sita Giri with the Humanitarian Advisory Group. I have been working primarily as a practitioner for the past 20 years, mainly in South Asia, Southeast Asia as well. And the speakers, all of you talked about gender mainstreaming. And during my work, working with communities, working on program design, two challenges that I faced often, and it goes on and on. One is the targeting, what is the right targeting, and you talked about process kind of monitoring. And the other is culture. I'm just back from Pakistan and working on basically helping with the inception phase of a program for the 5 tribal districts which have been merged now to the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. And we were looking at, as we were designing this new program, we are in the inception of this new kind of a 5-year program, we're looking at the immediate response, what were some of the lessons learned after the returnees, because this 5 district also has about 5 million returnee population that came after the conflict. And one of the lessons learned from the program that have been evaluating or who have implemented is the targeting was very ambitious, the activities could not be completed, and we couldn't do this. We need to have incremental approach in target setting to be able to achieve. While, of course, practically this sounds, yes, it's good, but then if we keep on doing this incremental approach, when will we reach there? When are we going to reach the gender parity? Because the benchmark keeps moving. So when are we going to hit that? The second, culture. We always use, no, this program has to be culturally sensitive. Is this activity culturally sensitive? And we end up having the same vocational skill design, tailoring for women, cooking, salon, beautician training. We never think out of the box because we always say, okay, this has to be culturally sensitive. And that becomes like it's used as an excuse actually to do something different. If we don't address these issues, we will keep on facing the same problem. I would like to hear from the speakers here if you had similar experiences or you may have kind of some lessons or something to share. It would be very useful to listen to you, or maybe from the participants here as well. Thank you.
What I might do, Tricia, is just take the question up behind you, the lady with her hand up, and then I can get the panel to sort of talk about all of the questions at once.
So thank you, everybody. I want to call out Joy because she's abandoned us. She's been meaning to teach us more or explain this more to us since last June, and she hasn't followed through on her promise. Promise breaker. But I'm Tulika, I work with Women's Fund Asia, and I am trying to understand, when we're talking about gender lens investing, what is different from what 15 years ago or 20 years ago when BRAC came in and started talking about self-help groups or making women entrepreneurs by giving them the mobile phones and setting up pay cells, somehow giving them some ability to control the resources they were able to earn and recognizing women's work, right? So how does gender lens impact investing, or the other way? What does it look like now? What is so principally different or normatively different that we're doing? Because just to speak to you, Will, when you talked about the cohorts and the women-focused, women-led, but we're still not talking about the practice of the cohort, what's happening within the cohort. And particularly given that, coming from an experience of SHGs in India, where women collectives were built by banks to do the sharing and some kind of loaning, and when the loans were taken by women in their name and were used by the family, and when the women were unable to return the loans, and public shaming was done, and we've had women's suicides because of that. So how do we look at this piece of investment or money as a tool to forward social justice? Or is there an intersection connection? And if you could just have more clarity around that.
This is a very high-pressure panel, so I'm going to hand the microphone over.
So I think both of the comments, I think, go well together. Look, gender lens investing could look like one massive exercise in pinkwashing and accommodation, right? We created some daycare centers attached to an incubation program so that women could drop their kids off where they came to the same crap place that still doesn't actually address whether or not they can speak in the room. So I do think there is, I take accountability, I hold some accountability for where the field is at, and I am alarmed, I will say. But for me, it's not, right now, I think, and this is what I was thinking when you were talking, that it's a problem of imagination. I don't know if it's a problem of metrics. And that's where we often go first. How do we make sure that they do what we asked them to do? I think we have to ask first, are we actually doing the right thing? Are we pushing far enough? So I see all the time, and this is where we have a broad program called the Power of Policy, which is literally looking at all of the donor governments in the world and saying, are they doing everything they can to hold the bar as high as possible, right? Or are we saying, well, the private sector said we couldn't do that because that's too hard for them, so we could only ask them to do this? And so part of the question is, are we asking for enough, which means not just, shut down your businesses and go broke, but a kind of imagination that says, here's what we could do if we rethought things. So we're working on, we have an ongoing dialogue with a set of very large asset holders, hundreds of billions of dollars, about what would be a future. How would you invest if you believed that in 10 years, gender-based violence could be cut in half? How would you invest today? Where would you put your money if you believed that in the next 10 years, gender-based violence could be cut in half? And you were there, right? You guys were in AVPN where that guy stood up and said, I tell this story all this time. This guy stood up, we were at AVPN. Right, you guys were there, weren't they? And he looks at me and he says, well, Joy, don't you think that's a little Pollyanna? And I lost it. I was like, so Elon Musk gets to say that we're going to live on Mars, and I think we're not going to beat the crap out of people, and I'm Pollyanna. So part of it is we have to make the conversation harder. We have to make what we're asking for. I'm not saying go out and demand that finance people do something that they can't do, but we need to have a bigger imagination about what's possible. And I'm afraid if we don't have that, we're going to be stuck in the incrementalism. I will say at the same time, I celebrate the incrementalism, and 85, there's now what, $100 billion or something, some relatively large amount of money that's invested that screens for women on boards. I want to celebrate that. I don't want anybody to keep telling me that women on boards is what we have to do to achieve gender equality, because it's not, right? So how do we get to a little higher bar? But we have to join the conversation to figure out what that higher bar is, and if we're not there at the front end, it doesn't work.
Can I just add? Look, I absolutely agree with you, and was going to say many of the same things, but I think one of the things is that we need to remember that we who are seeking change are part of the ecosystem ourselves. And, it's a failure of imagination sometimes on our part, but we've also got to remember that it's a failure of will on the part of the people we're seeking to influence, right? And we know that. It's the same wherever we work, whatever domain we're working in. People do think that, women, putting a couple of women on the board's near enough, consulting with a couple of chicks, that's fine, like what do they want? And, we know that these are just the tiny steps forward. So you've got to recognise your own place and your own power in it, and sometimes it's true that those who are seeking social justice don't have those levers available to them, and then we must accept small steps, right? Baby steps sometimes is all we can hope for. But you've got to know when your power's coming in as well, and I do think that now there is a moment for social justice and for gender equality. And when we were in DFAT, and we had a minister who was really keen. She really believed that she wanted to see gender equality integrated through the work of foreign affairs. And I would say to my gang, we need to be really bold here, and we need to ask for more, we need to expect more. And I said, and we're even up to the stage where we can mock people for doing badly on gender equality. Like laughing at people is when you've got a little bit of influence is actually a really powerful thing to do. They don't like you for it, but it works. And I think when you've got the influence, take it as far as you can go. And I think that the points you raised about are we being bold enough, why are we just settling for incrementalism? They apply for whatever aspect of work we're trying to influence, So it's always good to remember that we've got our own place in this, and to assess what power and influence and leverage we do have, and use it, take it as far as you can.
I think the other part of that, I'm going to join the panel for this second. I think there's also a moment right now for accountability. The period of handing out cookies for people who acknowledged a basic issue, that's done. We're done with that now. You don't just get to wear a lapel pin and say that you've created change. So I think and that means that the people who can pull those levers, and that includes governments and donors and people moving big amounts of money in partnership with the private sector, need to have an understanding about what an accountability actually looks like and be prepared to put that on the table. And so we need to learn that, but we can really see that happening. And I think that bar of I have a lapel pin, can I have a cookie now? That we need to move beyond that. And I think we're there. There was a question though about gender lens investing, versus those, or complementing, or is it a continuation of, or do they sit in parallel? All of that stuff around women's economic empowerment, those micro-enterprise, financial access, financial empowerment type things that we were doing, 10 and 20 years ago. How are these related? Is this a rebranding exercise, or is this a different thing, or are these kind of complementary movements that are happening? Anyone can take that question.
Look, I think that many of the learnings are the same. Many of the techniques and skills are the same. But we've, again, got to look at where the investment's coming from, what drives the investors, again, what's in their interests to make things different. And there are slight differences. A lot of, microfinance and microcredit was done, it was revolving, but it wasn't for profit, really. And so the incentives were different, and except for, it became commercialised, didn't it? In the end, yeah. But it started out really as a kind of development-led approach, and now we're seeing it moving along. And so, in that sense, I think it becomes part of the impact investing scene, right? Yeah. To the extent that it's commercialised, it is.
Well, and I think the broader question is just, again, I'll keep saying all the toys, and don't get stuck on one kind of capital, because then we're meeting the needs of the capital, not saying what does the world actually need and can capital be useful. And if we stop asking that question, then we are sure that we're not going to achieve gender equality, because we're simply catering to the money.
Sure, we're approaching time, but I have one last question down the front here.
Paul Bird from AVI. I just wanted a couple of things. One is you talked about shared value. Apparently there's a brilliant speaker on 5H tomorrow that will give a presentation on shared value, so I'd encourage everyone to come to that. And if you're not there, I'll know. The other one is, would love to know your experience around in what each of you are doing is what's the ripple effect in country. So a good example is we've done a business incubator with Intrepid Travel in Myanmar, and a lot of the change was trying to get the major banks to appreciate a small business and women's business. And it took us 18 months to get one of the top 4 banks to agree. A lot of work. I just want to know your reflection on that. How do you kind of get that change, sustainable change going, rather than having a kind of program that comes in, it ends, who knows what's left at the end. So how do you achieve that sustainable, on the ground, gender change?
2 minutes, 5 people.
I'm happy to chime in just quickly. Look, I think it is too early for us to say with the incubators program, but we are connecting with existing incubators and accelerators, right? We're not setting them up. And we are not just connecting with them, but we are then connecting them. And so practices that one in Myanmar, for example, has with engaging local financial institutions and working out how to de-risk or kind of advocate and bring them into investments in SMEs, that's a piece of learning that we can then transfer to someone active in Cambodia, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have, through the incubators program, begun that process. But I think it is too early for us to say.
So at least in Southeast Asia with our work, I mean, prior to the program being in operation, there were hardly any impact investments into women-owned, women-led businesses. So by the fact that our partners are intentionally doing that, they're providing an incredible demonstration effect that is rippling across the entire ecosystem and the region overall. Now, over time, we'll be tracking that to see how they're doing vis-a-vis other SMEs that they're investing in. But that's pretty powerful because investors are like bankers. They're always sitting on the fence, and then one person makes one deal, and then the floodgates open. And so that's what we're seeing in Southeast Asia. So.
I guess from the Pacific side, I guess the demonstration is kind of what we're there for. So we are there to, I guess, show what impact investment could look like in the Pacific, and it's not, in fact, mostly not going to be those private equity big investments. It's using local capital, it's using local banks, and figuring out a way that you can partner other forms of finance to leverage some of those local capitals. Like, for example, we're working with a Sydney-based organisation, Good Return, and they use private ancillary funding from foundations to underwrite bank loans from from Pacific banks to businesses that have a very strong gender supply chain. So they have a business, and their informal supply chain is primarily women, and they do a lot of gender analysis around that. So it's proving that there is the, I guess, potential or profitability within that model, working with those banks to understand what that can look like, and then showing that across the Pacific. I guess on the other side around the gender lens investing is working with Pacific organisations. So when we sent out a lot of intermediaries to say, use gender data, use gender research, they really didn't find enough to inform what they were doing. A lot of it was backwards looking, a lot of it didn't really understand the culture. So we found partnering them with actual organisations on the ground is one of the best ways to actually inform what they're doing. So so that's just the initial couple of examples I would have.
I was just going to say, I absolutely agree. I think, people follow money, people follow winners, and the demonstration effect is absolutely the first thing that we need to follow. But I also think it's not to be underestimated that there's an element of cool in all of this as well. People want to be at the top table with the big guys. And if the cool companies are doing it and making money out of it, everybody else wants to do it too. And I think that we need to sort of do that crowding in and making people realise that this is where the cool money is.
So I'll go back to the last piece, which is changing the underlying analytics of how finance assigns value, changing what structures they're using, changing their underlying processes. I actually think you can structurally change how finance works. So the reason I'm qualified to work in finance is I have a PhD in 19th century American history. And so I can tell you the date we made this crap up, because we actually made up how these systems work, and so we can change how they work. And in the end, that's the sustainable change, to actually have the systems function in a different way.
On that super profound note, I'm going to call us to a close. Thank you so much for being an excellent and super accountable audience. And thank you to our amazing panel. This has been super helpful, and good luck with the rest of the conference.
some trouble with the mics. Is the mic picking up? Yeah, okay, it is. We couldn't tell with the background noise. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Anthea Mulakala. I'm with the Asia Foundation. I'm one of the co-conveners of the conference, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this session on Chinese development cooperation. It's really difficult to have a discussion about 21st century development cooperation without the mention of China. Since the start of the conference, yesterday and today, I've heard many references. Some are blatant and direct. China, 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 it's all about China. Others are indirect and more generalized references to the non-traditional partners. And there's also metaphorical references. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. China indeed is a force that is challenging our assumptions, principles, and practice of aid and development cooperation. Our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Donald Kaberuka, noted that Africa, the continent, is often described using generalized and overly simplistic narratives. China faces the same treatment. So the aim of our session today is to provide some clarity and nuance to the China and development cooperation story in a few key areas. So we'll be talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. We'll be talking about China's institutional architecture for development cooperation, China's engagement in the Pacific around development cooperation, and also how China's working with civil society and the corporate sector. So our panel, I'll start on my left. Ji Hongbo is our country representative with the Asia Foundation in Beijing. Xu Lixu is Vice Dean of the China Institute for South-South Cooperation in Agriculture. She's also professor of the College of Humanities and Development Studies at China Agricultural University. Jihang Jia is the Research Fellow, International Economics and Finance Institute, which is part of the Ministry of Finance in China. And on the end, Yujia Shen, who is also a research fellow and academic at the National Center for Oceania Studies at the School of International Relations at Sun Yat-sen University. So we will kick off with a discussion on the BRI. The Belt and Road Initiative is now 5 years old, and BRI is much more than a grand infrastructure initiative. The Economic and Infrastructure Corridor is designed by China to promote development, trade and connectivity, policy coordination, financial integration, and also people-to-people links. At the last count, the BRI had 71 countries involved. At the same time, there's a lot of positive things about the BRI. So it evokes feelings of promise, of pessimism, of excitement, as well as fear. Jinghang. How do you respond to that? No, after 5 years, it's an important milestone for China. Is China doing a stock take on the BRI of what's going well and what can be improved? And in your perspective, what do you think is working and what isn't?
Well, thank you, Anthea. And first off, I would like to say thank you for having me here and inviting me. And it's an honor to be here. And as you all know, that the China proposed Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, and it's been 5 years. And of course, in the past 5 years, from my observation, that the BRI has gained enormous support from the international community, and we have made significant progress. And you mean domestically right now, from the top policymakers to the academia area, and all kinds of stock taking and assessment, and regarding the project, the progress and achievement and experience and even the lessons, and from the past 5 years are being conducted in China. And so I would like to share two official events with you. So last August, there was a symposium was held by Chinese President Xi Jinping and marking the 5th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the very recent one is last month. And a meeting was held by the Vice Premier, Han Zheng. He is the head of the leading group of the advancing the BRI work in China. And this meeting was, both of the meetings summarized the previous work we have done, and also they made plans for the future steps, what we're gonna do. So from those two meetings, they have summarized what have been we are achieving for 5 years, and those achievements, can be measured by some numbers. Like I would like to also share with you. So like for the past 5 years, there were, you said 71 countries were involved, and actually we have signed more than 100 countries, and as I recall, like 29 international organizations have signed some like MOU or cooperate agreement with the Chinese government. And the cumulative trade volume in goods between China and participating BRI countries are over like $5 trillion. And there are also China's FDI to those participating countries are surpassed like 80 billion US dollars. And we also create like more than 80 economic developing zones, and those are creating, at the number I remember, it's 240,000 jobs in the local community. So there are also many other numbers I can share with you. Like there are huge amount of like significant projects that along the Belt and Road Initiative, including the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And I won't list all of those actually. So like another major event that's taking place for the past 5 years, it's in 2017 that we held the first high-level seminar on BRI, which is participated by 29 state leaders. And a lot of achievements and official documents were released on that forum. And some of those outcomes has become concrete projects already. So, of course, we have seen those enormous achievements, but like we're still doing researches, and we know that China is learning by doing. And so we know that there are, of course, some challenges that are associated with the BRI. And the first thing I would like to mention is filling the infrastructure gap. And we know that there is a huge gap between the infrastructure needs and the investment. And we can reference numbers from ADB or either a lot of international organizations. They have those kind of estimation. And I think I remember the number from ADB, it's by 2020, and even for the Asian countries, and the infrastructure need every year, it's 776 billion US dollar. But the gap is 180 billion US dollars. And so like China is trying to build a diversified financing mechanism for BRI, since BRI countries is the most in the most need of infrastructure. But we know that China it can be the only country doing this, and we would like to create some kind of partnership with all the countries to participate and to invest, to mobilize more resources to do this. But that takes a lot of work, actually. And another thing I want to mention is for the past 5 years, and we also noticed that there are a lot of entities taking part into it, like most of them are cooperations. But we noticed that some cooperations, or we say companies, they did not fully follow international rules or standards, we say. And even some projects are using the title of BRI and take advantage of it. And I think that indicates that there's like supervision mechanisms need to be further improved. And I think China is willing to do this with international community. We would like to do this with local people and media, and we all together to identify those projects and to set higher standards and regulations to those projects. That's also another next step we're going to do in the future, I think. And the third thing I want to say it's which I think is the most urgent one, it's we need better communication with others, all the stakeholders, actually. And because China needs to explain itself better, just like you mentioned, and there are criticisms, there are people care so much, like you guys, I think thank you so much for interested in China's development policy. And there are criticisms, and I think China, a lot of recommendations actually from Western think tanks, and which is very helpful for us. So we're willing to take it. And But the thing is, there's still a lot of stereotypes and misunderstandings, even by culture, by history, or even the language. So I think China needs to do better to explain itself and to communicate with each other, and specifically to take further step on the policy communication and to the area, to the people-to-people exchange. So those are the three things that I think that we're going to do next. But let me back to those policy makers meeting. And I think next thing that China it's taking a step to is to focusing on the high quality and the high standard of developing the infrastructure projects, and which can deliver real benefits to the local people. And so Chinese policymakers realize that the general framework has been established. Like there's a macro level pathway of BRI has been pretty clear, but there also need some details and some specific areas that need to be fine-tuned. So I think that's our next plan for the future. And I think there will be more policy released because we're going to have second high-level meetings this year. So I think you guys will see more policies coming up very soon.
Great. I'm going to throw a really sensational issue at you. Probably the most sensationalized issue around the BRI is around debt. So how would you respond to the comment that the BRI is a debt trap for partner countries? Just look at Sri Lanka, for example. So how do you deal with accusations like that?
Thanks for the question. It's a really good one. I think right. I saw it on the news, and I think it's worth noting. Well, I think I'm going to respond from different perspectives. Like first, from the government policymakers' perspective, that from the beginning, the Chinese government has realized the importance of financial sustainability and debt sustainability. And there was a guiding principle of financing the BRI that was endorsed by, including China, like 27 countries endorsed the guiding principle. And there was a specific term regarding the debt stability, sustainability. And so, I mean, the government aware it's an important issue to be noticed. And what has China done? It's one thing. We work closely with MDBs, because we believe they have the enormous experience, and they have those international standards and rules and even the safeguards that accepted by the international community. So like on the first summit, I think we signed MOU with 6 MDBs, and they are willing to participate in it. And another thing we do is we do tri-party cooperation. And I think we're willing to cooperate with advanced economy, even including Australia, because you guys have a lot of experience and you are expertise. And China, it's, I would say, a newcomer to this international development area. So we have signed some tri-party cooperation agreement with Japan, Singapore, France, and Canada. I believe, as far as I know, those 4. So I think we're eager to have Australia get into it, and we can have tri-party cooperation in the countries along the Belt and Road Initiative, which can help China to realize the high standard of the infrastructure project. And well, another thing, it's from the more economic perspective, if we're talking about that issue. And well, you mentioned Sri Lanka, but there was a report that released by the Sri Lanka Central Bank that among all the foreign debt in the Sri Lanka's portfolio, that only more than a little bit 10% it's from China. The percentage is even lower than Japan, actually. And so I would say that, China, it's definitely not the cause or the driver of the increase of the debt problem. And so another thing I want to mention is where we kind of should see the debt problem in a more dynamic way. Because, from China's experience in the early stage of the development, and we borrowed a lot of money from World Bank. And we used it as to build the infrastructure, and specifically for the high-speed railway. And you know, the infrastructure projects has a really long return maturity. And so, like, we invested a lot, we borrowed a lot, but it turns out that it has a huge spillover effect to the growth of Chinese economy. So I think we should use those dynamic way to see that for the Belt and Road participating countries. And we can see that if we select the right projects, and that they will create huge economic benefits to their economic growth.
Okay, thanks. Another new development in China, which is fairly recent, is the establishment of the China International Development Cooperation Agency, CIDCA. It's interesting that China established this agency because Western countries tend to be merging their previously discrete agencies that were managing international development assistance. Richard did a stock take on that yesterday for Australia, into their ministries of foreign affairs. Asian countries are doing the opposite, setting up new apparatus to manage the growth and expansion of their cooperation programs. Xu Li, tell us a little bit about CIDCA. So how will China's international development cooperation policies and practices change now that you have this new institution or this new structure in place?
Thank you. Can you hear me, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, actually, I'm very happy to be sitting here. And once you are sitting here, means that you are interested in the topic. And once we have interest for communication, I think the world will not be bad. It will be better. And first of all, I should say that with increasing China's overseas engagement, what another kind of phenomenon we should also notice is that internally in China, the different people, they have different opinions as well. Even today, we have like a think tank for government. We have 2 professors from university. We have, international organization working in China, and full of us are ladies, not men. But we still, you can feel that we will still have a very different perspective about the story of BRI and also about China Development Corporation. So that's where I start. And so that's why when I put my argument or my opinion, we should really be aware that which is from the data or from the facts, and which are my personal opinion, my personal experience, based on my experience. So when you're talking about the role and also probably the relationship of the newly established agency to BRI, and also the news, if I put it from the website, official website, you can see it clearly, both in Chinese and in English, that it was established in the early of this year, last year actually, already 1 year passed. And it's for the 2 purposes. One is to promote or serve as the big diplomacy of China. And secondly, also jointly establish or jointly construct a Belt Road initiative. But what does that mean? Or play with Chinese words. So, and its roles, you also observe from the website, you can see that its roles including policy planning and project designing, and secondly, provide advisors to China's development policies or related issues. And thirdly, to provide supervision and evaluation. And also provide some kind of a partnership. So from all those words, you can see, yes, that's right. All the things are very right? But what does that mean? I really cannot understand. That's always happens. But in my personal, so following coming my personal interpretation, because we have submitted a proposal, policy proposal for China to establish the agency since 2013. And since that, we continue every year. And so last year, 2008, we are so happy to see that it was established. But of course, not only us. I think many think tanks, many academia professors, they submit a different version of this new agency establishment. But in our research and designing, we see that except those very brief interpretation, very brief description of the function of the SIDCA, we actually would like it to be to provide public goods supposed to be provided by the new agency along the Belt Road countries. Because, you know, this is, and also to solve the fragmentation issue. Because you know that in China, aid was provided or involved almost 40 different different organizations, ministers, departments, like a Minister of Commerce, foreign, the foreign aid department to be responsible for coordination. But the Minister of Health be responsible to provide health aid. Ministry of Agriculture also responsible in providing, aid in agriculture. And also the Bank of People's Bank providing, like a collaboration with multiple banks. So, and, lots of 40, more than 40. So fragmentation and lack of coordination was always claimed by the problem. So that's why we posted again and again to say, in the new era, particularly when you increase your scheme of foreign aid, you need to think strategically of the way, of the role of the China aid. So now we found a new way. When a Belt Road initiative come out, we say, okay, that's very good. All the countries, I think almost 70% of the country along the Belt Road, they are really they are basically in agriculture. Many of them are in the poverty. So development issue is always the very important issue. So we say that along the Belt Road, we should provide public goods, and the new agency will be a very approach to do this. So that's a kind of an interpretation. And also someone was asking, why you put this diplomacy and Belt Road? What does that mean? And probably, you mentioned about official or statement about the Belt Road. But actually, we can see that the economic cooperation will be the main element for Belt Road. It's not like, China has agenda behind, or according to my own observation, sometimes they are fragmentation, and they are, still struggling what we do. But for economic cooperation, that would be, for development, is the main aim of Belt Road. But diplomacy, it's like some kind of another perspective, like a political or other national interest. So from a national interest or from public goods, for global development, we coming together, and the aid could be provide an archive for that. So that's my interpretation.
Thanks. You mentioned quite a few times, you said we were pushing for years to try to get the establishment of an agency. So I want to ask you a little bit more about what you mean by we. So I know China Agricultural University has been a really active actor in China on development cooperation, informing policy, informing practice for a long time. And recently, you've set up the South-South Cooperation Institute. What's the role and the mandate of the institute, and how does it help kind of shape development policy in China?
Thank you for your question. It seems to give me an opportunity to introduce my organization. You can see from my introduction, actually from China Institute for South-South Cooperation in Agriculture. Actually, we have another name. The name is the Belt Road Institute for Agriculture Cooperation. So many of you would ask, what does that mean? You have two names. Actually, we only have a team, but have two names because it's the fact that in China, we realize that when we communicate with our international friends, South-South cooperation would be a good name to communicate, particularly with United Nations organizations and all those academic. But for internally, communicate with ministers, and in China, currently, we're using Belt Road. That would be better. Because in South-South cooperation, you can find lots of different departments. They're all responsible for South-South cooperation. So we don't know how to coordinate. So you can see the story even before a name. But for our organization, it was newly established in the December of 2017. Actually, we start our studies and practices in international development since the 1980s. So you're mentioning that China is a newcomer for international development. Maybe I didn't agree with you. Because China provided aid since 1950s. And even before that, China also a very big aid receipt since the 1970s, end of 1970s and 1980s particularly. And so at that time, our organization, at that time we have a name called Center for Integrated Agricultural Development. It was provided originally by Germany. And so they provide aid to China to establish this kind of institute to provide technical assistance for those foreign aid projects in China. So our partners will be United Nations, all those different agencies, and also bilateral organizations like DFID or UCID or OCID, CIDA, all this different, and also NGOs like Ford Foundations and WWF, all those. So that's make us a very value assets. Like we understand how the international development projects were designed and operated in China's context. And since 2007, even earlier, I think, the leader of our team, Professor Li Xiaoyun, he is very active in the international development cooperation policies and researchers. And he realized suddenly a new phenomenon came. He was always invited by some dark countries, researchers as well, and policymakers to say, would you please to provide some advices on how Dhaka and China can working together to provide, trilateral aid to other countries, for example, in African country. So that will make us make him very surprised and say, okay, we need to change. We need to shift our knowledge production focus. We need to focus, we need to understand how China's development aid in other countries. Even though that China's practically, it was initially since 1940s, 1980s. But the studies on China's aid is very, 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 shortage. Even in my 2004, when I just started my work, I remember that I organized a workshop and invited officials from, minister to say, okay, would you like to introduce China aid to our Germany audience? And then we feel like, okay, no, that's a secret. And how could you talk about aid? So today, I feel it's really good. It's a progress that we can talk about China's aid. And so that's a progress I can see. So from this process, you can see that we established this organization to see that we change from just on the introducing in foreign aid in China to how China aid other countries. So you can see from the knowledge flow from introducing in to going out. And we have 4 modalities. The first one is to provide, we call the new development knowledge. Because I know that many professors sitting here, so I'm so sorry to see, but I'm really curious to see whether in the transformative global landscape, we really can provide new knowledge for development. We have to challenge our existing wisdom. And secondly, because we are university, so we are much more open and neutral way to organize policy dialogue. Some of the dialogue will be happened in the United Nations. Some of the dialogue will be happened just in the field of Tanzania, for instance, last year. And thirdly, we also train, because we are university, so we have the advantage to train young talents, particularly for the youth leaders along the Belt Road. And lastly, but also is a very unique way, is we not only publish, we also provide development projects. We put ourselves into a practitioner to see, working jointly with local government officials. For example, in Tanzania, our project has been implemented for almost 10 years. And we're now in the third phase. And the project is just to provide a community-based poverty reduction joint learning center. So it's not saying that all the Chinese development projects are big scale. This morning I heard about that. They're also smaller, but also based on the community. And we're working with them. And at the first stage, we're just introducing a simple labor-intensive technology to improve their maize productivity. And after 4 or 5 years, we realized that the local government capacity is the most important. So right now, we're working with local government, with local university professors, and also the local communities. The 3 of them are coming together to create synergies for local initiate development. For just I sitting here, 3 of my colleagues are in the field in the Tanzania, and we see them in the WeChat, how they working together. So I'm sorry, probably time is too long, but if later, if we have more time, we can communicate about this project. So that's all the project we're calling it for peer-to-peer sharing for development. So that's our new idea for new development knowledge.
Thank you, Shuli. I think you really gave us a good overview of really how diverse the kind of academic and institutional capacity is in China, how long it's existed. And there are so many institutions, actually, that are contributing academic research. Also, a lot of your comments just now would be very applicable to the session earlier today on applied research, and I think a lot of the work that your institute is doing really fits into that kind of framework.
Yes.
I'm going to turn to the Pacific now. Yujia. China will or has surpassed Australia as the largest development partner in the Pacific region with approximately 4 billion. You can correct me if I'm wrong, their pledge last year. And although Australian aid and Chinese aid focus on different sectors, China's increasing footprint has concerned many Australian observers who worry about Australia's declining influence in the region, increasing debt and dependence for partner countries in the region, and that Australia is being squeezed out of the Pacific by China. And that the approach by China seems to be more competitive than collaborative. So I'd like to ask you, maybe you could help clarify or demystify for us, what is China's approach in the Pacific?
All right, thank you for your question. First, I would like to say that I think China has surpassed the US, but maybe not Australia. So, the first statement I want to address is that China's engagement with South Pacific, I have to say, in the last decade has been surging. But in general, if I ask anyone in China, do you know Papua New Guinea? If I just randomly ask, the answer would be no. So last year, I attended an international relations conference in China at Tsinghua University, which is a very high-level academic meeting, happens every year in Tsinghua. And that was the first year that that conference had a panel on South Pacific. For all those years, that conference has been holding. So, and also, when my colleague learned that I'm going to do studies about South Pacific, they were asking me, how are you going to get your paper published in China? So, well, I think this is a general sense about how much China know about South Pacific. So then I'm going to move to the question about how's China's engagement with the Pacific area in general. I think if we understand China's Pacific policy in a more broader framework, then maybe we'll get a sense more objective. I think first is that China actually calls the South Pacific as the great peripheral country. So in 2013, China held a great peripheral foreign meetings. It's a very high-level meetings on foreign policy. All those standing committee attended the meeting, and the ambassadors to the big countries attended that meeting. And on that meeting, they proposed the concept of peripheral diplomacy. And at that meeting, they clarified 4 regions as great peripheral region, and that included Southeast Asia, South Asia and the West Asia. But then later on, they added 2 regions in that. One is South Pacific. Okay, so that generated a huge debate among a lot of Chinese scholars. They said, why? Why would you put that in? And the debate is still going on now. And also, I think another important background to understand China's South Pacific policy is South-South cooperation. When I traveled to Papua New Guinea and traveled around Pacific, I talked to some of the ambassadors from China, and they said, well, China views its relations with the South Pacific countries as South-South cooperation, and it has been essential to China's foreign policy. But I say that, I think from my observation, China's policy towards the Pacific, or its South-South cooperation with the Pacific, is no different from it is with other South cooperation partners. So it's not like, I don't think, I personally don't believe there's a huge agenda behind it. I see it more as a general foreign policy goal. And of course, the third one, that it's why is China so interested in the Pacific? If anything, I want to say that as a geopolitical goal that China always set is Taiwan and China unification. And the Pacific has 8 countries that has diplomatic relations with China, and it has 1/3 of Taiwan's allies or diplomatic relations partner in that region. So I think definitely there is some engagement of China with those countries trying to win more partners and friends, and I think that's one of the another reasons that China is interested in the region. And I think that's it, like more for like a, because I always wanted to understand the Pacific policy in a general, broader sense of China's foreign policy as a whole, rather than looking at it, because Pacific to China is relatively small in size. Okay, you know what I mean. So, yeah.
Thanks. Looking ahead, do you see the engagement, China's engagement in the Pacific, do you see that there's opportunities for collaboration with Australia?
Okay.
So that the relationship moves from one that's perceived to be competitive to one that is more cooperative or collaborative?
Okay, I want to address that question. Before I want to address that question, I want to talk briefly about China's activity in the Pacific. So I went to Papua New Guinea for 3 times last year, and I started to look at the history of how China has been engaging with the Pacific. And I think the first wave started very early on, even before World War II. So, and that was a small group from the south part of China, like from Fujian and Guangdong province, and they went and they started to build those retail businesses. And then the second wave, I think, started in at the beginning of the 2010, and where you see all those state-owned enterprises started to go in, and I think that attracted a lot of attention, because those ones are big. Those are big companies, and they brought funds and they brought projects. And a lot of those SOEs went in there because of China's aid program started to go in that region. And then when they got there, they found business opportunities, and then they started to bring their partners back from home and to go into the market. And I think this third wave is coming now. So I see that the emerging interest from the private sectors in China into the Pacific, because I have been getting a lot of consultations from the private sectors because I'm based in Guangzhou, and if, as you may know, that a lot of the companies that are operating in the Pacific are from Guangdong province, and a lot of them, the private sectors one are, and they are from Shenzhen. So I think those are the ones that are getting more involved in the Pacific investment, more for commercial interests. So I mean, like when we're talking about the collaboration and all that, I think it's just not talking about the government-to-government collaboration. It's also about the cooperation between different sectors and on different levels. So I definitely say, I hope I'm not too naive, but I definitely say that there are cooperations chances between China and any countries, partners who's interested in the development of the Pacific. And also, I think Australia is shifting its aid projects into the infrastructure sector, which is very different from the approach that Australia used to have with the Pacific, because back in maybe just before the last year, Australia had a lot of aid projects that goes into the governance, education, and health. And I think they're starting to making a shift to the infrastructure. And I think, I hope that there would be some cooperation between China and Australia on that sector. I was asked a question by a colleague, and I would like to propose that question here if anyone is interested to answer, is that do you think it's possible that China builds a road and then Australia maintains the road? And okay, so, and then the second one is, I've heard that is the trilateral project that's already operating in Papua New Guinea is a malaria project. It's working very well, and I think it has generated a lot of positive feedback. So, I mean, there are successful examples, so I definitely see the possibility. At least it's worth trying, right? And I think another thing that I want to talk about is that China, I want to try to dispel this myth, is that China has a military interest in the Pacific, because from my observation and from all my engagement with the consular offices and the embassies there, and I barely see any officers from the national defense from China or anyone from military. At the moment, I don't see that coming, and I think at the moment, I think it's a lot more about being, the media sometimes created some like myth in that, because for all those times I've been there, I haven't seen. Of course, there are some general visits, but they visit a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia, and then they do the sort of like a stopover in Papua New Guinea, and then they go to other countries. So, I mean, like the military interest in that region, I haven't observed that. And China's investment in, if you look at it, in Pacific is relatively small, like in numbers. And that's why it's so hard to get my paper published.
Thank you, Yuja. I think you raised a really hot topic as that last issue, so I'm going to transition to another issue now. Honghua. South-South cooperation has changed considerably since its resurgence this century, and China is really leading the way. This change by diversifying its partnerships to include civil society, to include corporations, the private sector as well. The Asia Foundation is an international NGO with a core program on China's global engagement. What's the working environment like in China for an organization like ours, an international NGO that has its headquarters in the US? And has this changed over time?
Thank you, Anthea. And I want to say that I'm really happy to be here. My first time in Australia, first time at this conference. And so far, the panels that I've heard, the discussions, including from my Chinese colleagues just now, have been really fascinating. The operating environment for international NGOs in China, as many of you may know, has really evolved over time with the main dividing line being the promulgation of the law on the management of activities on mainland China by overseas international NGOs, which happened in 2016. Prior to that law, the legal framework for international NGOs was incomplete. A handful of international NGOs received registration under the Ministry and Departments of Civil Affairs, but the rest mostly operated in a legal limbo, and some sought commercial registration. So since the 2016 law, according to the law, registration has become the responsibility of public security, while sponsorship needs to be secured from an approved list of quote-unquote professional supervisory units before an organization can be registered. Once a rep office is set up, this international NGO can operate within approved program areas and in approved geographical areas. Or an unregistered international NGO need to work with Chinese partners remotely, paying occasional visits, on temporary activity approval permits. And this is mostly the responsibility of the Chinese cooperation partner. Since the law in 2016 until the end of 2018, 441 representative offices of international NGOs have been set up, and about 1,300, close to 1,400 temporary activities have been approved. The Asia Foundation has been working in China, programming since 1979. We have had a physical office and presence since 1994. In June of 2017, about 6 months after the effective date of the law, we received our legal registration, our Beijing representative office, and our president paid a visit soon after that. It was a very joyful moment for the whole foundation to be able to receive a formal legal status after so many years of working in China. I think over the years, especially in the past decade, the foundation's work has also changed because China is quite different now compared to 1979 or even the 1990s. So we've evolved from focusing mainly on domestic programs, working on Chinese social and economic development issues and US-China-Asian relations, to working with Chinese partners and taking advantage of the foundation's network of 18 offices in Asia and our deep local knowledge to facilitate greater mutual understanding and more responsible, greater mutual understanding between China and the rest of Asia, and also more responsible Chinese behavior in Asia. So more specifically, our global engagement program has focused on three main areas. One is providing specific, country-specific community perspectives on how Chinese aid and investment is perceived in the Asian countries where China provides a huge amount of aid and investment. And second is to try to help improve China's overseas investment behavior from environment, gender, community engagement, and governance angles. And the last part is strengthening Chinese NGOs' capacity to provide international humanitarian assistance when disasters happen in a foreign country, or and to build the capacity of Chinese NGOs to do long-term underground development work in other parts of Asia.
Thanks. Just to pick up on your point about the Asia Foundation's work with Chinese companies overseas, what is the Chinese government doing? I want you to tell us a little bit more about what we've been doing, or the Asia Foundation's been doing to work with companies to increase their social impact. But what does the Chinese government do to promote more sustainable Chinese investment related to the BRI or not?
Chinese government encourages companies to take care of the communities where they work or invest, and this include communities in a foreign country context where they're receiving Chinese aid and investment. And this is mostly reflected in the many guidelines and manuals that have been produced by the Chinese government on responsible investment, on CSR, on social responsibility. And these are mostly released by government agencies or industry associations and a lot of the industry guidelines have the support of government ministries. For example, in 2013, Ministry of Commerce and Ministry of Commerce, who's mostly managing overseas investment, and Ministry of Environment jointly issued guidelines on environment protection in overseas investment and cooperation. In terms of industry association, for example, 2014, the China Chamber of Commerce of Metals, Minerals, and Chemicals Importers and Exporters, CCCMC, issued China guidelines for social responsibility in outbound mining investment. Well, some companies, I think especially big state-owned enterprises, do pay attention to these guidelines and try to follow. Many more other Chinese companies find it challenging in terms of meeting international sustainability standards. There's also the issue of the lack of incentive for those other companies who may not be supervised by a government agency, smaller companies, private companies. On the environment, so for example, on the environment impact of Chinese investment, we're striving to help improve the environment standards, the ESGs, of Chinese policy banks, so that these banks can require higher standards of Chinese companies working from the financing angle. On the social side, Chinese companies face challenges on community engagement. Traditionally, they have paid more attention to the recipient government, getting the buy-in, working on the relations with host country government, than local communities. They don't tend to view local communities as risks that they need to manage. They also don't have a lot of experience or tools or personnel dealing with community engagement or local knowledge or experience working with local or Chinese NGOs to help them do this. Now, there has been a lot of bad cases that have been publicized both by international media and by domestic media and by the government. And there's a growing realization within the corporate sector that they have to do better in terms of community engagement. So the Asia Foundation has been working with CSR consulting firms, with industry associations to produce community engagement guidelines and manuals and provide training to companies. At the same time, I think it's also very important that Chinese NGOs can play a role working alongside with Chinese companies. So we've been, in terms of working overseas in a foreign community. So we've been trying to build the capacity of Chinese NGOs in this area as well. We jointly with Chinese partners developed the first ever operational manual for Chinese NGOs doing international work. We also recently completed a Nepal-specific manual for Chinese NGOs, so that when they go to Nepal, they know what the local legal environment is for international NGOs, what the local labor standards are. We also jointly, with Chinese partners, developed a code of conduct for Chinese NGOs working overseas. And this code of conduct actually draws heavily from the Australian code of conduct for NGOs international work and the Korean equivalent code of conduct. So I think NGOs can play a growing, increasingly important role in more responsible Chinese behavior in other countries.
Yeah, thanks, Hongbo. I think your comments really reveal how diverse Chinese development cooperation is, how much it's changed from the traditional, and now it would be almost stereotypical to say that it's just kind of government-to-government cooperation. It really has diversified, and it's very inclusive, much more inclusive in its approach, and looking at not only state-owned enterprises, but also private sector companies in China, as well as Chinese civil society. There's lots of scope for capacity building, but it's great to see that the Asia Foundation is working on that. So we have some time for questions. We're almost right on time. So I'd like to thank all our speakers for their comments and then open it up to the floor for questions. Okay, so I'm going to give you a number, okay, so you don't forget. So 1 at the back, the man in blue. Anyone else? 2. Okay, 1 and 2 to start. Please go ahead. We need, yes, the mic. Yeah, right at the back there, Caitlin. Straight up the middle and up the back.
Hi, I'm Duncan from the APNIC Foundation, the Internet Registry for the Asia Pacific. Thank you. It's a very interesting discussion. I have a question for all the panel, and it's around philanthropy in China and foundations. We're aware of foundations in China, such as the China Internet Development Foundation, the Tencent Foundation, that are starting to invest and make resources available around internet development, for example. Does the panel think the government is supportive of foundations like that investing outside of China, such as large foundations in the US would invest in projects in Asia? Is there official government support and encouragement for foundations in China to invest outside China in development projects, in addition to official work, do you think?
Thanks for your question. We'll take the second one. Just here. Yeah.
Hi there, my name's Jeremy Stringer. I work for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in the aid program, and most recently I've been working in the private sector team as we look to ways to work with business to unlock the potential to solve development problems as well as achieve businesses' requirements of a sustainable development return. But my question's really in relation to the last comments from the last speaker. In regards to the government's, and correct me if I'm wrong please, I didn't understand if it was the government's efforts to build capacity of NGOs in gender and environment and other areas like that, or if it was the Asia Foundation. And also the look of the government working beyond NGOs as well into the private sector, and particularly the mentioning about ESG standards and working with banks to raise those standards so that they expect higher standards of Chinese companies. My question is, do the Sustainable Development Goals come into that conversation in China in regards to the work on gender and environment with NGOs and in regards to ESG standards and the work with banks?
Thanks. I'll take one more if there is another question at the moment. Yeah, down here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It's really insightful. In terms of, you talked about reshaping BRI 2.0, what are those regulations? What are those things that you want to put in place to improve Belt and Road Initiative, if you have an idea of those, whether they're environmental or other regulations around that, with a particular view to, excuse me, how Australia is shaping up theirs? It's obviously some lessons that could be learned.
Thanks. Okay. So the first question was on philanthropy in China, Tencent Foundation, and how China's responding to that kind of overseas work. Who would like to take it? Anyone? Don't fight over it. Go ahead, Julie.
Thank you for the question. Actually, when talking about NGO in China, it's a long story. As I mentioned, in 1980s, even my study when I was a student, basically my learning and my work also related to the NGO. But basically at that time, the NGO, China's NGO was supported by international organizations, like Ford Foundation, and the Asian Foundation later on. But basically, recently, there are lots of changes happened because with the emerging middle class, so-called middle class in China, those that be rich in China. So they are also very interested in set up the NGOs. But for the NGO going out to other countries, as far as I know, so there are also two schools. One school is the originally NGO which worked in China previously, but now working in Southeast Asia. So like, as far as I know, like China Poverty Reduction Foundation. And they are actually worked a lot by providing humanitarian and also disaster relief support in Cambodia, Laos, and I think currently they are number one. Previously, they also another one, like the Youth Foundation. But you know that internally, because of some kind of public debates on the relationship between the business and the philanthropy, so then internally they stopped. Because at that time, many Chinese criticized this organization. They said that they established many primary schools in African country. And many public criticized that in China, we have so much number of people in poverty. How would you use such resources in other country? And also it's related to some kind of public affairs like showing off, one daughter of some kind of a responsible person show off in the social media about the lectures, bags or something. So that's the scandal. So then, unfortunately, it was stopped suddenly. It's a very pity. But anyway, there are I think basically they are some NGOs working in other countries, even though that is it's just still in the process. It's not so many. And on the other side, there are also young students or young generations, like who born in 1980s, 1990s, who were studies abroad, like both of them, and they established their NGOs in Kenya, like we know that China House, and they working very closely with local people, and to help others understand China's business engagement there, and also bring the Chinese to the Africa. So you can see these two approaches in China.
Julie, just to clarify, I think the question was about the private support and whether the government supports private funds for NGOs to work outside China, funds like from Tencent Foundation and other sources.
The level of government support. I think
you covered it. Okay. Did you want to add anything? Thank you.
Professor Xu just now mentioned the development of the philanthropic sector in China, and it's indeed growing very rapidly. You mentioned Tencent Foundation. We had a 5-year project that recently ended, looking at how to strengthen the capacity of Chinese foundations to become better grant makers. And the reason why we're doing this for 5 years was about 5 years ago, we were seeing this trend of wealthy individuals and private companies set up foundations. And about 5 years ago, the number of Chinese foundations was around 3,000. 5 years later, by the time we were ending the project, there's over 7,000 Chinese foundations. So the sector has grown very rapidly. But in terms of their overseas work, working as an international NGO, working in other countries, the number is still very limited. Professor Xu just now mentioned the China Poverty Alleviation Foundation is one of the forerunners of Chinese NGOs doing this. Mostly, they receive their funding support actually from the general public or from the private sector, the corporate sector. In terms of, especially when they are out there in a foreign country providing humanitarian assistance, they're actually able to raise a fairly big amount of money through the internet, facilitated by platforms like Tencent, to raise money for disaster assistance. In terms of government support, if you look at 5 years ago, there was very little articulation, even from the Chinese government, in terms of involving non-state actors, involving NGOs in international development cooperation or foreign aid. But this has also gradually changed in the past 5 years. President Xi Jinping mentioned at the C20 in Qingdao a couple of years ago that the government would like to see more NGO participation. But when you talk about actual funding, that's still very rare, very little. Yeah, a pilot project by Poverty Alleviation. A pilot project with money funding from Ministry of Commerce to the Poverty Alleviation Foundation to manage overseas volunteers program, Chinese volunteers going to other countries. But I think when we talk about funding support for NGOs doing international work, we probably should mention the South-South Cooperation Assistance Fund, announced by President Xi Jinping in 2015 at the UN. And later, he added more money to it in 2017 at the BRI Forum. So the total commitment into the fund is $3 billion US. And a lot of it is supposed to be supporting the involvement of Chinese civil society organizations in international development cooperation work. But I think it's still going to take time for the government, especially with the newly established agency who's going to be managing this fund, to set up procedures, evaluation mechanisms of NGOs and CSOs that they are comfortable giving funding to. So the South-South Cooperation Assistance Fund is not, there's no money going from the fund right now to Chinese NGOs yet, but we hope to see that coming in the months to come.
Thanks. It seems like the UN is benefiting a lot from the South-South Cooperation Assistance Fund.
The first
at the
couple of dozen projects
supported by the fund
have all gone to UN agencies.
Okay. Hongwa, can you continue and answer the next question as well? That was about ESG. Who's building the capacity of NGOs? Is it Asia Foundation, or is the government doing some of that? I think you've touched on it already.
When I mentioned...
And the SDGs, sorry.
Yeah. When I mentioned, strengthening the gender, environment, governance aspects of Chinese overseas investment, it was mostly about the Asia Foundation's work. But as an international NGO working in China, and I think it's the same philosophy that we follow everywhere we work, our work is based on and driven by local demand, and we work closely with like-minded partners in the country. So we're seeing, for example, a growing interest and demand from Chinese partners, from policy banks to industry associations to companies, to say we would like more help, we would like more assistance on better understanding of ESGs, and particularly also experiences and procedures from MDBs on how ESGs have been implemented. So for example, you have all these standards, but structurally within an MDB, how do you make sure it actually works? It's actually being implemented and incorporated in all the different steps of financing. So we're seeing a lot of demand from the different actors within China on these improved standards. Yeah. Was your second question about SDGs?
Yeah, whether those standards are being linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think a broader question whether the SDGs are actively seen as relevant within the Chinese development context.
Yeah. For Chinese companies, you would rarely see them or hear them mentioning the SDGs. Even multinational companies operating in China rarely talk about SDGs. They probably mention SDG alignment in their CSR report, but I think it's understandable. I mean, they have to be able to associate SDGs to their business practices, and a lot of times it's very difficult for companies who are not experts on policy and framework and goals to be able to associate that. And sometimes when the limited number of Chinese companies do talk about SDGs, it's more for branding. So they have a big event with UNDP and they say we're associating their business practices and results with the SDGs. But overall, the use of SDGs is not very high within the corporate sector.
I think that's quite distinct from the government's approach. I mean, China has really embraced the SDGs through the BRI and is very active on the SDGs at a multilateral level as well, but it's taking some time to sort of filter through to the private sector. Thanks to both of you for those answers, quite comprehensive. Jaehan, on BRI 2.0, so what's in store?
Thank you for your question. And the first thing I want to say, it seems like you're over-interpreting what I'm saying. I would say we're reshaping it, and I would say it's 2.0. It sounds too big. It just, what I said, just those like summit or working conferences are those on a regular basis. Say the working conferences was held on every half year. It's a regular meeting. And the summit is every 2 years. And it will be one of the most regular working mechanisms. So I'm not saying we're reshaping it. I think we're making it better. And because for the past 5 years, we're in an initial stage. And that here I want to explain a little bit more on the newcomer thing. And because before, from my understanding, we're more like recipients. And we never took the lead. Like here, we are trying to take the lead to create a platform that everyone can get into the platform and share the benefits. But the thing is, for the past 40 years during the China's development, China has never done the thing before. And so I don't think we don't have enough experience on this, but we do have enormous experience on infrastructure construction, which China has benefited a lot. That's why China wants to share it with the BRI countries who in the most need of this one. So that's what I'm saying. Regarding how to improve the standard, as I just said, we love to work with the MDBs, and we love to work with advanced countries. And say another thing, it's like say there was a new institute that founded by China, and we with IMF, and the institute is specifically training government officials from BRI countries regarding their financial sustainability and regarding their capacity building stuff. So that's an angle, and we're working with the MDBs. And another thing I want to say, it's we try to maintain or get the high standard and international rules. We also want to emphasize we want to be country driven. Because a lot of BRI countries, they're all developing countries, and we want the projects in their most need and to satisfy their demands. So we have to balance here, I guess. So here maybe Australia can be involved to provide your wisdom in this, how to fit the international standard and be more country driven. And we would love to hear your experience in this.
Thank you. We have still a little bit of time, so are there any more questions? 1 and 2.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the panelists. It's very insightful, and it's good to see my fellow Chinese here to present. So my name is Qing Rui. I'm from International Council for Voluntary Organizations, basically a global network for NGOs in humanitarian field. So my question would be really related to the engagement of NGOs with the new CIDCA. So I really wanted to know your perspective on this, because I actually had a mission 2 weeks ago in Beijing, and I had a few conversations with stakeholders there, particularly from the NGO side. So I think at the moment, because the CIDCA is taking time to shape up their policies and the future plans, I think the NGOs have a lot of expectations and also a lot of guesses on what could be the possible approach for the new ministries to engage them. So I really want, because you are all insiders in one way, so I really wanted to know, what's your perspective or your observation on that. Thank you.
Okay, and one more, sorry, make you run over there. Do you want to take that one, Julie? Do you want to take that? Okay, this is the last question.
Thank you. Just wanted to hear the panel's thoughts on the, no, we haven't mentioned the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank yet, and where that fits in relation to the Asian Development Bank and BRI. Just hear a few comments or thoughts on that. And we're talking a bit about integration of Australian organisations and businesses with BRI and the Chinese aid program. Is there any advice you've got for Australian businesses or small organisations to get involved in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or BRI program?
Okay. Julie, do you want to take the question on SIDCA and NGOs? What will the approach be?
Thank you for your question. Actually, one of the benefits I came here is the important role of NGO in the SIDCA's future operation. Actually, the rules on regulations or the approaches for the South-South Cooperation Fund has been published, I think, what time last year? And you have already found that in the website. And when you read it carefully, it emphasizes so much about social organizations and the international organizations about for the future candidates. So when they're talking about the social organizations in China's context, it should, and it must include the NGOs. And because, as you know, that the regulation was issued by Minister of Commerce, and now the new SIDCA has come up. So it's obviously lots of work has been done. And if you pay attention to the public WeChat platform of SIDCA, you can see in the last year, there are lots of visiting from multilateral organizations, bilateral organizations, NGOs, mutual cross visits to SIDCA, showing hands, take pictures together, sign memorandums, all the works. And this is good, just for us to understand what's going on. And also, but these things is just a kind of establishment to tell you that it's in the progress. But it didn't tell you what they really talk and what's really focused. And but you can mention, so through the last year, I would call it a year of establishment, and also to get familiar what really would be doing. So this is a very key point that get lots of suggestions from outside, from expertise to let them know that what will be what will be proper. So I was supposed, even yesterday I consulted some of my key informants related to this job, and they say it's still in the process. As Hongbo also mentioned, they will get the procedures to make them comfortable to see how to work. But I want to mention another aspect of the NGO work story is in China's internally development. Now the heated debate for NGO involvement in development is what kind of expertise, particularly very strong expertise, comparative advantage of NGO in providing development domestically and internationally. For example, in China now, the biggest strategy internally is poverty alleviation. And so, but we can still use lots of gender balance or good governance or environmental sustainable development. All those all those narratives we are very familiar with. But technically, how to provide a training, how to communicate with officials, how to communicate with local communities, if they really highly play a catalyst role. So that would be the future way in China's domestic NGO development. So I think it also fits in the our overseas engagement.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next question because we're running out of time, but thank you.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. On the AIIB question, you're right, we didn't talk about AIIB. It is linked to BRI, so I want to give both of you an opportunity to answer the question, one about where does the AIIB fit into the BRI, but also, Yujia, do you have any ideas about how Australian business can be more involved, perhaps, in the Pacific?
With the cooperation with the Belt and Road Initiative?
Or otherwise, yeah, with China.
I think Australia has already signed up to the BRI with China on the trilateral cooperation. So not in Australia, but like China and Australia could cooperate in a third-party country. I think Australia has signed that MOU with China. So I definitely see that there could be cooperation. And also, I think if BRI is branded or like conceived as or interpreted by the outside that it's a government initiative, but then I think if you look at the private sectors that's emerging from the China, and then moving to the Pacific, then I think there could be a lot of opportunities for Australia, companies, private sectors, and also I have learned that when I was in Port Moresby, when I met these government officials from China, and he's asking me, do you know any consultants from Australia that could give us some advice about help our business to set up in Papua New Guinea? Because a lot of those companies come from China to going in Papua New Guinea. They are willing to learn, and they are willing to get the experience and the expertise from the partners that are already been there for many years, and they actually value that. So I think, yes, there's cooperation and there's opportunity.
Thanks. Jingham, on AIB?
I'll take the AIB question. Well, I think it's been 3 years since it's established, and it's running very well from my observation. And so China plays a role in the bank as the stakeholder, as other MDBs. So like we are seeing AIB as a partnership. We're trying to build partnership for the BRI, just like World Bank, ADB, and they're all the same for us. And so when I mentioned we're creating a diversified financial system, we're considering those MDBs as a very important channel, like financial resources, because they have built a strong project database, and they have really good projects that can be funded together. So they're doing all this together, like parallel investment or all kinds of ways to all kinds of cooperations. But one thing I want to mention is I think AIIB has more than 90 members countries right now, and a lot of them are BRI countries. So definitely there are a lot of areas that China and AIIB can cooperate in the future in many ways. And another thing regarding the small business channel, I think, and we have country offices from Ministry of Commerce in all the countries. So I think if the company wants to get involved into the BRI project, they can either directly go to the country office, or there is an official website on the Belt and Road Initiative in English, and we are building a project database as well. And well, it's still in a progress, and we're collecting data, and we're trying to improving it. But it's all on the website, and I think small businesses or other institutional investors, if you are interested in, you can just get on the website and looking for the projects you're interested in.
Thank you. Thank you. Hope that answered all of the questions. Thanks very much to all our panelists. I'm going to try to sum up some of the general conclusions in about the last minute before we break. On the BRI, your explanation was so clear. I think what it revealed to us is that the BRI is very much an initiative and not a strategy. China is really taking the lead in creating an economic platform, and is inviting and opening the door for others to collaborate, participate, not just from the public sector in other countries, but also private sector as well as civil society participation. So, come on down and get involved, seems to be the message. In terms of the infrastructural, the architecture for development cooperation in China, that's also changing as the scope China's development cooperation increases. We have SIDCA, we have your new institute as well. I think you can see that China is devoting time and resources and energy into trying to work out a collaborative partnership amongst different organizations to manage the resources. But it's still very complex. In the Pacific, there's definitely scope, I think, and willingness for cooperation with other countries, particularly Australia. I really like your suggestion, you know, China, if China builds the road, will Australia come and maintain it? That's not a bad idea to think about for Belt and Road Partnership down the road. And then lastly, around partnerships, I think we talked a lot about NGOs and private sector, and you can really see how China is demonstrating in word and deed how South-South cooperation has changed so much. It really is about diverse partnerships with the private sector, with civil society, that really defines, I think, what we all mean by beyond aid and development cooperation in the 21st century. So thank you so much to our entire panel, and thank you to the audience. This is the last session of the day, and that drinks are somewhere on the courtyard. Drinks are over at University House. You have to go out and then take a pleasant walk down the road. Thanks.